Good morning, everyone. My name is Maria Victoria Müller. I'm an Argentinian social worker and postgraduate student of the Department of Human Rights and Human Development of Rabindra Bharati University, Kolkata. It's an honor to welcome all the dignitaries and address all the participants today on the seventh and the last day of the international webinar on vulnerable groups and human rights, jointly organized by the Department of Human Rights and Human Development, along with the Department of Disability Studies, Rabindra Bharati University. Before moving forward, I would like to state that today we have two great occasions as well. Firstly, the International Human Rights Day that is observed every year on 10th December, the day the United Nations General Assembly adopted in 1948 the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The UDHR is a milestone document that proclaims the inalienable rights which everyone is entitled to as a human being, regardless of race, color, religion, sex, language, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status. Available in more than 500 languages, it is the most translated document in the world. And secondly, it's a very special day for me as we are having Social Workers' Days in Argentina today. Now, let's begin with the program. As we're making this event more and more engaging, we will be looking forward to make today's event, that is the last day's session, equally informative as well as innovative. To begin with, I would at first like to invite Dr. Payal Rai Chaudhuri Dutt, the coordinator of the Department of Human Rights and Human Development, Rabindra Bharati University, to deliver the welcome address and introduce our eminent resource persons with the participants. Over to you, ma'am.
Congratulations, Victoria, on this day, Social Workers' Day for Argentina. And thank you very much for engineering this program, along with Upasana, Abhishek, Pubali, Taruk, Parveen, and for doing all this together. And for the very last time in this webinar, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. And a very warm welcome to everyone out there who signed up for this virtual international seminar on vulnerable groups and human rights from around the world. After a very immersive last 6 days, we continue to explore vulnerability. Today, we do it in the context of a whole section of the population who are losing their incomes even as we speak, forced out or evicted because they are often seen as virus carriers and trudging along hundreds of kilometers while many never really make it to the finishing line. The migrant workers, indeed, have emerged as the face of this pandemic. While the COVID 19 has worsened inequalities prevalent in all regions of the world, in this case, with the resultant economic downturn, it has emerged as the single most dire humanitarian crisis. Today, we have amongst us two very eminent resource persons to discuss these issues and to set the keynote for the day to progress. The first is a former professor of international relations at Jadavpur University with over 3 decades of teaching and research in this area. She has been very widely published nationally and internationally and contributes to many allied disciplines such as human rights, indigenous peoples, women's studies, and so on. Also, a particularly warm person, Shunjukta Di is a very much a friend as she is a revered learned senior professor. Thank you for agreeing to speak to us this morning, Di, and welcome. Our next speaker for this day is Professor Mesbah Kamal from Dhaka University, an expert in the area of international human rights law and a long-time professor from Bangladesh, who is a very familiar face in the academic discussions programs on this side of the border, and with whom we at Rabindra Bharati University have had a very long and warm association. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us here today. I also extend a very warm welcome to Professor Michael George O'Hayes once again, and thank you, sir, for so kindly agreeing to chair the subsequent session. And especially warm welcome to all the eminent paper presenters for today. We look forward to the discussions that will follow, and we hope we can come out with something valuable as in the other days. And finally, welcome you all once again to this very august occasion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am, for elucidating the day's subject quite efficiently. It's a privilege to be here today to represent the dignities from different fields. Today, we'll be inviting lectures and presentations on migrants and refugees from various resource persons, students, and professionals. Before proceeding to the invited lectures, I would like to brief the participants that we will be welcoming your questions on each lecture as well as presentation, which you can drop on the comment section while the respecting person is performing as soon as they finish. To move on with, I would now like to solicit Professor Sanjukta Bhattacharya on the screen. Sanjukta Bhattacharya, currently retired, was a professor of international relations at Jadavpur University, Kolkata, India, for over 25 years till June 2016. Prior to that, she taught at Gargi College, Delhi University, and in Delhi University American History for 10 years. She has a master's degree in history from Delhi University and a PhD from Jawaharlal Nehru University in International Relations, New Delhi, specialization in American Studies. She has received the prestigious Fulbright Award twice in 1987, 1988, and 2004. The first time to do postdoctoral work on a comparison between affirmative action programs in the US and the reservation system in India. And the second time as a visiting scholar based in Texas College, Tyler, a historically black college. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Payal, for your very, very generous introduction to me. Now, I first thank you, the organizers, for inviting me to this webinar, this international webinar. The Department of Human Rights and Human Development and the Department of Disability, Rabindra Bharati University. And thanks to, in fact, the Vice Chancellor, who is an alumni of the university where I taught for so many years. Today's presentation, in fact, is going to be quite a general presentation, but I'm going to touch on certain specifics, highlighting the issues of refugees and migrants. And first, therefore, my greetings to everyone all over the world on this Human Rights Day. Now, I'd like to begin with a statement of the economist Jean Drèze, who said that the pandemic lockdown had almost been a death sentence for the underprivileged of the country. To quote her, and I'm quoting here, the policies are made or influenced by a class of people who pay little attention to the consequences of the underprivileged. This sums up the plight of not only the poor, but especially the migrant workers in India, who number in millions, given the lopsided nature of development in this country, where in fact you have less developed countries, less developed cities, and you have developing areas where, of course, people will naturally move in hope of better work. But before going into the plight of these migrant workers, it is important to draw distinctions between refugees, asylum seekers, international migrants, interstate migrants, interdistrict migrants, and illegal migrants, all of whom are affected in different degrees, some more than others, depending on their status. Refugee, asylum seekers, and migrants are often used interchangeably, but there are legal differences. Refugees are those who have their own, who leave their own country because they are at risk of serious human rights violations and persecution at home, uh, and because their own government cannot or will not protect them from these dangers. Refugees have the right to international protection according to the UN uh, Refugee Convention of 1951 and its 1967 protocol, and various regional instruments like the 1969 OAU Convention, the 1984 Cartagena Declaration, and the Common European Asylum System, and the Dublin Regulation. According to these, apart from basic protections, they cannot be returned to their home countries where they risk persecution. That is, the principle of non-refoulement. However, many countries have not acceded to the UN Convention or its protocol, and this includes India and all South Asian countries. And so, therefore, they are not bound by them and do not follow the norms set by the UN. Asylum seekers are those who left their own country to seek protection from persecution and serious human rights violations in another country, but who have not yet been legally recognized as refugees in that country and are waiting to receive a decision on their asylum claim. Seeking asylum is a human right according to international human rights and refugee laws, and they too are protected in countries that have acceded to the relevant UN resolutions. So far as migrants are concerned, there is no internationally accepted legal definition of migrant. Amnesty International understands international migrants to be people staying outside their country of origin but are not asylum seekers or refugees. People leave their country for various reasons like work, study, to join families, but also because of poverty, political unrest, and natural disasters. The latter do not face persecution in their home countries but live with hope of a better life. The people cross borders and therefore they're international migrants. What is important is that people who cross borders may be called refugees, asylum seekers, or migrants, legal or illegal. Uh, at bottom, they are men, women, and children. That is, human beings. And being human, they have human rights, which all humans all over the world have been guaranteed by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and therefore have a right to protection from violence, exploitation, and forced labor, apart from the basic rights like right to life, security, etc. Most countries have acceded to the UDHR, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the CEDAW, and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And relevant portions of these conventions also apply to refugees and asylum seekers and to migrants. So far as international migrant workers are concerned, there are several international instruments for their protection. But at the outset, it may be said that India has a very poor record of acceding to these international instruments and therefore not bound by them. The International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of the Migrant Workers and members of their families is a UN General Assembly resolution of 18th December 1990. There are additionally many relevant instruments under the framework of the International Labour Organization, notably the Convention concerning migration for employment, the Convention concerning migration in abusive conditions and the protection of equality of opportunity and treatment of migrant workers, the resolution concerning migration for employment, and the recommendation concerning migrant workers. The purpose of mentioning these instruments is to emphasize the futility of enforcing international laws without any viable enforcing authority. Uh, in the very best of circumstances, these were violated. Under the circumstances of the coronavirus pandemic, which country or authority would be bothered to enforce such laws on violating countries, especially if these countries are not even signatories to the relevant conventions? Coming to illegal migrants, these are people who enter a country without proper documents and, if apprehended, face detention and deportation. The US and Europe, offering far more job opportunities, have hundreds of thousands of such illegal migrants who cross borders clandestinely and melt into the workforce, but cannot avail of basic social protections like healthcare since there is no documentation to regularize their stay. India too has illegal migrants, particularly from Bangladesh and Rohingyas from Myanmar, but since they have entered through border loopholes, the numbers are unknown. They too have no valid papers, and since they refuse to become visible, Their plight during the pandemic lockdown is unreported and unrecognized. The other type of migrants, interstate and interdistrict, can be found in every country. Large numbers migrate to other parts of their own country for jobs, marriages, to join families, and for work opportunities. There are also these high-end employers who basically, both in the government and in the private sector, they earn high, they save high, and they're posted in cities and states which are not really cities or states of their birth. Uh, but they have job security, savings, proper accommodation. So therefore, in fact, I'm not going to discuss them. They're not really the subject of this paper, though actually there are very large numbers of such migrants in this country. And there are those from the lower social and economic strata who move to find better occupation and pay. In the US as well as in Europe, there are several seasonal workers, but because of social security laws and in Europe, protocols which protect such migrants across borders, access to healthcare, education, housing, etc., may not be so difficult to find. But in India, despite the Interstate Migrant Workmen Act of 1979, the low-end migrants, although they are the pillars of India's development boom, working as construction workers, road builders, and even domestic workers, giving opportunity to middle-class couples to go out and work, they are largely invisible, and their plight too was not visible before, in fact, the pandemic lockdown made their plight into a humanitarian crisis. Most people just focus on the crisis of interstate migrants in India. But let me first speak of the many other categories who are affected by the lockdown and reduced to poverty. First, the refugee population. India is not a signatory to the 1951 Convention, and therefore its management of the current estimated 250,000 refugees and asylum seekers in India has at best been ad hoc, even before the lockdown. But during the pandemic, these vulnerable groups were neglected. Denied access to many documents, these humanitarian migrants are often excluded from formal systems of socio-economic inclusion and can fall into the margins of society, affecting not only themselves but future generations. COVID-19 exaggerated their vulnerabilities. In India, there are two categories of refugees. Asylum seekers from neighboring countries, chiefly Tibetan and Sri Lankan refugees, are directly managed by the government, while those arriving from all non-neighboring countries, but also Myanmar, which shares a border with India, are required to approach the UNHCR. Most asylees under UNHCR's jurisdiction are from Myanmar and Afghanistan. In 2020, Tibetans accounted for 108,230, Myanmar for 21,049, Afghanistan for 16,333, and others, for instance, Somalia, for 3,477. These, of course, are the registered asylum seekers. There are millions of economic migrants also living illegally, some putting the estimates around 10 million, living without documents and therefore without the means to transit into legal residency. So far as those under the jurisdiction of the UNHCR are concerned, their refugee status is not always institutionally recognized by the Indian government, leaving recognition to the discretion of individual authorities like schools and health care facilities. The COVID-19 lockdown exposed the extent of these refugees' vulnerabilities. The ambiguous legal status left many unable to access medical care or government relief efforts, and when the lockdown cut off incomes, few had savings to rely on. Even if some are eligible for Aadhaar cards, since these can be issued to anyone who has been a resident of India for the past 180 days prior to issuance, UNHCR refugees have been denied Aadhaar cards on the grounds that they are not legal residents in India. Now, this is a catch-22 situation since legal resident is not defined in Indian law, and unauthorized migrants are prohibited from obtaining other cards under a 2018 Supreme Court order. At the same time, the government made Aadhaar cards mandatory for accessing a host of public services and benefits like education, advanced healthcare, bank accounts, employment, and even mobile phone cards. Though the Supreme Court overturned many of these in 2018, many institutions continue to insist on Aadhaar cards. With lack of documentation, COVID-19 was a game changer, excuse me, in many ways for these refugees or for illegal migrants. The lockdown meant an end to income because none of these people have permanent jobs. The UNHCR did provide some assistance to those under its jurisdiction, but not enough. The refugees and asylum seekers had little access to government systems of ration and food distribution and uncertain access to healthcare. Many were said to be afraid to approach hospitals for fear of being reported to the police. So, when international travel began in late May, UNHCR received requests for help from those choosing to return to their country of origin, where they may be vulnerable to persecution, but where they could at least rely on family networks for sustenance. So far as Tibetan and Sri Lankan refugees are concerned, that is those directly under government jurisdiction, I have not been able to find anything on their status during the lockdown, since apparently they are out of the media gaze. So there is no record of their economic or health status, just as there is nothing on illegal immigrants who have no documents to help them get government rations or healthcare, and would be too afraid of detention and deportation to even ask for any kind of assistance from government authorities, formal assistance that is. Yet there are 10 million illegal immigrants who work in India as domestic servants and in informal industries that shut down, leaving them with no work. Only God knows how they have fared for themselves during the lockdown. In the next part of this presentation, I will focus on India's international and internal migrants. So far as international migrant workers are concerned, in 2019, India had the largest diaspora in the world in this category, sending back billions of dollars in remittances and contributing significantly to its economic boom. While the US attracts many skilled workers and those with capital to invest, migration to Europe is mixed, highly skilled as well as low skilled. In fact, way back in 1977, when I was going for study to the United States, via London, that is the Heathrow Airport, I was most surprised and rather shocked to see that almost all the sweepers in the airport toilets were Punjabi women speaking Punjabi. Now, this kind of thing still continues, and migration of low-skilled workers is still going on, as I have seen even very recently as well, the past few years, and especially in January this year when I was in London. However, the bulk of the semi-skilled and unskilled workers go to the Gulf countries. Since oil prices began rising in the 1970s, out-migration began from Asian countries to fill the workforce gap. Between 1990 and 2019, migration from India increased threefold, making it the largest country of origin. Some estimates note that 8 to 9 million, say around 8.5 million, stay in 6 countries, particularly Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, Oman, and Kuwait. Half the migrants are unskilled, 30% are semi-skilled, and only 20% are skilled. But together, they constitute 30% of the expatriate workforce in the Gulf. The vast majority of the expat workforce is temporary, blue-collar workers who have paid exorbitant recruitment fees and lead a precarious existence defined by a foreign labor sponsorship system that formalizes their insecurity by tying the workers to their employers. The Gulf states imposed stringent measures at the end of March 2020, closing down many of the industries that employed Indian blue-collar labor, including airports, tourism and hotel industries, construction industries, malls, etc., leaving tens of thousands without jobs, incomes, and the inability to pay rent. The BBC on 15th May reported the fate of a young Indian couple, a husband who had been laid off work from the hotel where he was working in, and the wife was 32 weeks pregnant. They had to spend 2 nights in the car park of the same building in Dubai, where they had an apartment. But they were evicted from this by the landlord for non-payment of rent. Now, they could not pay rent because the husband stated that he had not been paid his salary for the past 2 months, and he did not have any money to return either, and was very worried about the status of the unborn child. The condition of those who were stuck due to non-flights was pathetic. Many lived in rooms that accommodated 8 to 10 people, using bunk beds called bed space, and used common toilets, spaces where social distancing was not possible. In April in Kuwait, Indian localities like Jrib al-Shwaika and Mahbula were quarantined, and it was reported that 530 of the 993 confirmed cases were Indian. In Dubai, 500 Indians, especially from the Al Ras area, uh, were confirmed to be infected by the coronavirus. And the situation in Qatar was very similar. There, these were mainly low and semi-skilled labor with little ability to pay for their medicines. On the flip side, many doctors and nurses in the region are of Indian origin, and these were the frontline health workers. In fact, 57% of the medical staff in Saudi Arabia are Indian nationals. There was a rush to return to India, as I could see on a flight. I came back, in fact, on 21st March and was myself quarantined here in a government facility, which I do not want to talk about here. But basically, I was flying back from Chicago. The Chicago Dubai flight was almost empty, but the Dubai Calcutta flight was jam packed with returning workers. And these were obviously people who could not even read or write because, in fact, they had to be helped to find their seats because they could not read the seat numbers. And in fact, some of us were requested to fill in the quarantine forms before they got in because, well, they could not read, they could not understand. So you can understand the kind of workers who we are talking about. When return flights began in May, 200,000 Indian nationals registered immediately to be repatriated. Despite several flights, it was difficult to bring back all. Not only was it difficult to get flights back, but also to find the money for the flight and for the 14-day mandatory quarantine, for which, in fact, by now they had to pay. In Saudi Arabia, several were jailed. Some for illegally selling water or vegetables to make ends meet when the lockdown violations began. Others for signal breaking, also for lockdown violations, etc. Mostly because they did not understand the local language or laws. The jails in Jeddah and Riyadh had, according to one inmate who was later released, hell-like conditions where they faced starvation. Some of these were able to take a video of a jail in Riyadh and they sent it to a media house in India. And this media house pressurized the Indian government, which put pressure on the Saudi government. And in fact, some of them were released. 362 of them were brought back free of charge as late as October. Loss of jobs and repatriation to India of these low and semi-skilled labor will have a twofold consequence. Firstly, Indian migrant workers sent back remittances amounting to almost 83 billion in 2019, according to the World Bank. The first consequence, therefore, is that these remittances will decline, impacting not only our own GDP, but also the livelihoods of the families of these migrants. Secondly, the returning migrants will have to be rehabilitated in suitable jobs, jobs which were taken mainly by interstate migrants in their absence. For instance, a Keralite plumber in Dubai had been replaced by one, say, from Odisha who had migrated to Kerala. The reverse migration of the Kerala international migrants is bound to impact the prospects of interstate migrants in Kerala. The government did not think of rehabilitation or reintegration of these returning workers till at least August, perhaps expecting that they would return at the end of the pandemic. But first, the pandemic is far from over, and after facing severe trials and tribulations, some of them may choose not to return. And second, the countries of the Gulf are themselves cutting down on immigration of low-skilled labor, promoting nationalization policies and increasing taxes, making these countries not so attractive for this kind of labor, a trend which actually began some time back as oil prices began to fall and development began to decline. The government of India announced a scheme called Swades, Skilled Workers Arrival Database for Employment Support, which aims at forming a database of returned migrants with information regarding skills and experience in order to meet the demands of Indian and foreign companies. To facilitate employment, the details of the registration is supposed to be integrated into the Skill India's ASEAN portal, that is Atmanirbhar Skilled Employers Mapping Portal, which was launched as late as 10 July 2020. But the issue here is that a large portion are workers with very low skills like hotel bearers, house cleaners, etc. And the skills that companies actually seek are, well, engineering, technology, management, and such like. The government would do better if they decide on training these returnees in skills and language, since they're not adept at either. And finally, we come to the interstate and interdistrict migrants, many of whom have the same issues of lack of integration as the refugees and asylum speakers whom I mentioned earlier. Although they're Indian nationals, because social protection systems like ration and healthcare and even education are not synced across and between states. And that which is available to the resident of, well, a certain state where they were born, may not be available to the state where they go for work. The issue of ration cards is also true of inter-district migrants because many of these have their ration cards in their own village. And in fact, they have not basically got ration cards in the cities, for instance, Calcutta, where they work. Now, when the lockdown started, and basically the government announced free rations, etc., they could not avail of these because they had their ration cards in their villages. And they could not travel back to their villages because there's no transport. So far as interstate migrants are concerned, the Census of India defines a migrant by place of birth as a person who is enumerated in a place that is a village or town which is different from their place of birth. But actually, if you go by this definition, almost every Indian, well, not almost every Indian, but a vast majority of Indians would be migrants. Migrants by place of last residence, perhaps, is a better way to account for internal migration. The 2011 census estimated about 454 million international migrants out of a total population of just over 1.2 billion, which means one third of India's population is a migrant population. In 1991, the figure was 232 million, and in 2001, it was 314 million. Going by the rate of increase, as we see over 10-year periods, the number of migrants may be calculated around 600 million in the present year, 2020. Out of this, about 140 to 150 million are unskilled or low-skilled migrant workers with temporary, casual, and informal employment who are vulnerable to exploitation. The exponential growth of migrant workers can be explained by the uneven growth of the economy, with development being concentrated mainly in cities. Between 2011 and 2020, the central government introduced several programs for urbanization-led economic growth. For instance, the 100 Smart Cities mission of June 2015. Rupees 98,000 crores was approved by the government for 100 smart cities and the rejuvenation of 500 others under the Amrut project or Atal mission for rejuvenation and urban transformation. This attracted large numbers of workers, unskilled workers from elsewhere to build roads, flyovers, bridges, rebuild houses, malls, etc. There's also a boom in the hotel and various leisure industries which needed semi-skilled workers with basic education. These migrants form the huge underbelly of India's working class and support the economies of both the cities and the villages they come from because they remit part of their earnings home and help to sustain the agricultural economy. These sustain India's vast and largely informal economy while remaining mostly invisible themselves. They do not have employment guarantees, social security, or government assistance. The Interstate Migrant Workmen Act of 1979, which I mentioned earlier, was aimed at regulating living, pay, and working conditions of internal migrants, but has remained ineffective, like so many other Indian laws. One major problem is that this act places the onus of ensuring that domestic migrants receive their entitlements on the same employers who may be exploiting them and making it well, basically worth very little at the very base. Internal migrants face many vulnerabilities and challenges. There are cultural and linguistic barriers between states, and further, migrants to other states, as I said, may lose access to their state administered benefit programs, preferential education opportunities, etc. The low-skilled workers often take up daily wage labor, are among the lowest paid, have little or no accommodation, as you can see for the large numbers of street dwellers in most Indian large cities. There is no central registry of migrant workers, so you have no idea of the scale of difficulties that overwhelmed them during the lockdown, despite government efforts to put up shelters and provide free food. The sudden announcement of the nationwide lockdown on 24th March led to widespread panic as construction work hotels, transport, including rickshaws, autos, offices, malls, just about everything shut down. As the economy began to dry up, migrant workers with meager savings were in no way equipped to brace the lockdown or practice social distancing. Their plight was a result of the ineffective and inadequate strategy responses of the government and employers. The government could have given a window of 5 to 7 days when they could have been provided with special buses and trains, uh, uh, who had, especially to people who had no social safety to fall back on. Bangladesh had done something like this before imposing their lockdown, but our government was dramatic, almost all its actions were dramatic at the beginning of the pandemic, without any idea how long the lockdown would last, and basically without any idea how many millions of migrants there were who are low skilled and with hardly any savings. They could not pay their rent and therefore were evicted. Many had no recourse but to try and get back to their villages where they had at least family support. But there was no transport, so many resorted to walking and cycling, as in fact Payal has pointed out earlier, thousands of miles. Their stories were captured by the media and broadcast internationally, so there is no need to recount these again. But just some reminders. Many were arrested for violating the lockdown after being apprehended at state borders. On 31st March, about 120 migrants were beaten up by the police in Gujarat and forcibly rounded up, and they're put in a single lorry, that is no social distancing, and they're dropped off in Maharashtra despite being wounded. In Aurangabad, 16 migrants, as we all know, and basically were shocked at the time, they're killed in a freight train accident on 8th May when they were sleeping on a railway track, too exhausted, almost to semi consciousness, to realize that the train was coming after walking all day. Another 26 were killed when two trucks collided in Auria on 16th May. How many deaths actually occurred? The government says it has no data. But there are some unofficial data. According to CNN News 18, there were 971 deaths by July 2020, which are not due to the coronavirus, but due to causes like starvation, suicide, exhaustion, rail and road accidents, police brutality, and denial of timely medical care. And most of these were marginalized migrants and labor. According to Save Life Foundation, an NGO on road safety, 198 migrants were killed in road accidents by 2nd June. Several trains and buses were launched by the government later in May, but what needs to be pointed out is that at the beginning of lockdown 1.0, there were only 500 coronavirus cases in this country. But when the stomach specials were started, the increase in infections was exponential. Moreover, stomach specials were not free, with additional charges over normal fares. Facing opposition from other parties like the Indian National Congress, the government announced that railways would offer 85% subsidy, which states would have to find the remaining 15%. But the government later disclosed to the Supreme Court that it was not paying anyone's fare. It is not surprising that migrants still chose to travel in large groups in cargo compartments of trucks or travel by foot. How did the government respond to this large humanitarian crisis? Its response was too late at one level and too little at another. Too late because they had no idea about the millions of migrants, and there was no database, and they had never figured in any policy discussions at any level, central, state, or local. And too little because this was the first time that we're really hearing that there are about 600 million, almost half the population of India are migrants, though not all of them are low skilled or semi skilled. Basically, but at least 150 million of them are marginal, informal, daily labor without savings or social protection. On 27th March, the Home Ministry ordered states to ensure that migrants would not move during the lockdown, permitting states to use the National Disaster Response Fund to provide food and shelter to the migrants. On 29th March, the government issued a sweeping order directing landlords not to demand rent during the lockdown and employers to pay wages without deductions. But enforcement was poor, and there were thousands who did not have proper accommodation in any case. Some of them were living on the streets, and well, many of them are paid daily wages. So how do you basically ensure that they paid their wages if they're daily wage labor? Moreover, the order regarding payment of wages was withdrawn in the guideline for lockdown extension on 17th May. On 16th May, the government announced the National Migrant Information System as an online database to help streamline movement of migrant workers, and the plan was to keep workers updated by feeding their phone numbers into the system. The problem is that for many such workers, the complexities of the system is incomprehensible given language differences, lack of mobile data, and the level of education. Further, the state government set up relief camps and began providing free food. NGOs and individuals also jumped into the fray and provided cooked food. By mid-April, state governments had set up 37,978 relief camps across the country and
Ma'am,
26,000 food camps. Yes, I'll be.
this is to, okay, this
Yeah,
is to inform you you have only 5 minutes left.
5 minutes. Okay. Now,
Thank you,
to
ma'am.
ensure financial, basically, to ease the financial problems, the government announced many other programs like a 1.7 lakh crore spending plan for poor through cash transfers, and also an increase in the Mahatma Gandhi scheme to 200 rupees from 182, and a rupees 1,000 crore from the PM Cares Fund to support migrants on 13th May, and many other similar programs. But I'm going to cut down on this, and you can always basically look it up. But basically, like many other such schemes and yojanas, have we heard anything about the implementation? For instance, the One Nation, One Ration card. It was supposed, 83% of this was supposed to be completed by December 2020. But have you heard anything about it? Similarly, the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana was announced on a public-private partnership to basically provide cheap housing. Now, have you heard about this cheap housing also? There are many ifs and buts, basically hurdles and challenges. For instance, even if you have this One Nation, One card, the PDS system in the country is not synced, and basically they have not looked at the supply side as such. But one last word before I really end, that is basically this is about women, the more invisible among the already invisible. Uh, they basically the TV broadcasters showed a lot of men walking back and cycling back. What about the women? Where are the women? But basically, with the middle classization of Indian cities, there has been this exponential growth in the women labor force, migrant labor force, because there is need. Uh, as middle class couples, middle class women go to work, they need healthcare, or rather, basically, domestic workers to look after their children and the elderly at home. Private hospitals are mushrooming all over the country. They need cheap nurses, that is, trainee nurses. And these are often brought from Kerala, West Bengal, and many others with 2-year diplomas, and they're paid less and they're exploited. Apart from that, well, leisure industries have started. Malls have begun. Now, you find that basically many are working there as beauticians in the salons, in the cinema halls, in malls, and basically, well, they're not paid very high. There are two categories of women migrant workers. One is, of course, those you saw, the wives of the male migrant workers, and they themselves very often work as cooks, cleaners, co-workers in construction sites or brick kilns. These are mainly pre-state workers at the bottom of the road. Now, they were mainly the silent other, caught by TV cameras walking back stoically with their husbands and children when the lockdown began. The other group is basically single women, say from the northeast, from other parts of India, who in fact do all these service jobs which I've just talked about. Now, we do not see them basically at all. Perhaps they were asked by their families not to go back home, but basically there is nothing regarding them over here. So in this presentation, I've really cited, just give me 2 minutes, I'll conclude, okay? Uh, now, lots of facts and figures, but what do we get out of this? Firstly, Point one, business and industry are dependent on migrant labor that is paid less, work longer, and is more flexible than local labor. They can rarely speak the local language, very rarely represented in any union, and often exploited by employers, landlords, etc. Their vulnerability makes them easily controlled, cheap, and disposable. Second, despite being indispensable for economic growth and development, they have been invisible in policy making, and neither the center, the states, or local governments has ever bothered to inquire into their working conditions, despite constitutional guarantees in the Indian Constitution regarding healthcare, food, shelter, and safety for all its citizens. Third, women migrant workers appear to be second class citizens among these, well, basically workers, this category, since hardly any data is available about them, their living conditions or their working conditions or what they did during the pandemic, how they fared is really not known. Fourth, the plight of the workers was the result of badly planned lockdown policy of the central government, which apparently had no idea about the extent of migration or the migrants' conditions, since they had so far been invisible. The government did try to pump in money, but these were basically too late to prevent death, disease, and poverty. Fourth, this is a suggestion. Now that migrant workers' plight is out in the open, stringent measures should be taken up for migrant workers' welfare. Migrating workers are normal and necessary in any kind of developing society. Keeping this in mind, since ours is a welfare society, welfare state, migrant workers' welfare through job security, adequate pay, proper housing and benefits should in fact now figure in any kind of policy dialogue, and there should be implementation. Fifth, for international migrant workers, worker returnees, rehabilitation and reintegration in India or remigration with government overseeing work, pay, and living conditions should be enforced. And finally, one can only hope that this pandemic will end soon. But we still do not see the end of this, and we also hope that this pandemic or such emergencies will not occur again. But in case they do, one hopes the government is more aware and effective for all sections of the people. This is my hope and wish on this Human Rights Day. Thank you very much, and I'm sorry I've taken a few more minutes than I should have.
It's okay, ma'am. Thank you so much for sharing such useful information with all of us. It was not only surprising but equally engrossing, and it was really interesting to hear about you. So thank you so much.
Thank
Now,
you.
I would like to please stay here on screen. We will put you on backstage. We have some questions that we will answer in the end of the session. Thank you, ma'am. Now I would like to introduce Professor Mesbah Kamal, Professor of History in Dhaka University. Dr. Mesbah Kamal, Professor of History in University of Dhaka, Bangladesh, is an expert on diversity, plurality, and marginality issues and has authored, edited 23 books and numerous research articles on indigenous and Dalit, untouchable populations, peasant and trade union movements, secularism and cultural studies, Bangladesh Liberation War, and South and Southeast Asian regional and sub-regional cooperation. He has conducted more than 40 surveys for a host of UN and international agencies. He has also served as the chair of the GOB Expert Committee for Identification and Enlistment of Marginal People and Communities of Bangladesh. Professor Mesbah Kamal is an internationally known human rights defender and currently serving as technocrat member and coordinator of the Parliamentary Caucus on Indigenous Peoples. He is also the chairperson of Research and Development Collective, RDC, a leading research and policy advocacy institute in Bangladesh, and was the founder general secretary of Bangladesh History Congress. He is also a member of the Human Rights Commission formed by International Union of Anthropological and Ethnological Sciences. He is also a media personality reputed for his politico-social analysis on contemporary Bangladesh and Southeast Asian affairs. Professor Mesbah Kamal has also served BBC World Service as a news producer and broadcaster in the late 1980s and early 1990s. He has also published and edited monthly journal Samaj Chetna, Social Awareness, for more than a decade. He's currently the president of Jono Itihas Georgia Kendro People History Research Center. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Victoria, for kindly presenting me in such a nice way. I hope you can listen to me. Yeah.
Yes, we can listen
Okay.
to you, sir.
I will also require your help for.
Yeah, I'm sharing right now the screen.
Yeah, by sharing the screen. Okay, thank you very much, and thanks to the Department of Human Rights and Human Development and Department of Disability Studies in Rabindra Bharati Universities. Rabindra Bharati University, which I consider as my second university, for organizing this international webinar on vulnerable groups and human rights. And today's session is on migrants and refugees. And I'm really honored to be able to share the session with Professor Sanjukta Bhattacharya. And thanks to Professor Payal as well for inviting me. I'll be speaking on Rohingya crisis today, and I'll focus on the historical roots, though I will, if time permits, I'll try to reflect on the corona situation in the Rohingya camps in Bangladesh. As you all know, there are more than a million, in fact, 1.2 million, 1.12 million Rohingya refugees currently in Bangladesh. It's a huge, huge number, which huge number of Rohingyas who are currently in Bangladesh and mainly in the camps. So the corona situation is likely to have a serious impact on the Rohingyas, though very fortunately it hasn't been that bad so far. However, Victoria, please, let's move to the next slide. This is a slide which shows, the Rohingyas kneel down and being guarded by the um, by Myanmar's army and the locals of other nationalities in their homeland. Next one, please. And if we quickly look at this map, this shows the Bangladesh-Myanmar border, and you can see that this is not a very big border, and yeah, please let's move. Next one. Yeah. In fact, this is one of the most marginal places in the world, as it has been mentioned by Professor William van Schendel, the famous Dutch historian, an expert on South Asia. He says that it is unimportant because, because, just a second. Because the borderlands are generally marginal places, and it is unimportant because, for both Myanmar and Bangladesh, because Myanmar also has a very big border with Thailand, which is more important to them. And for Bangladesh, Bangladesh has a very long border between Bangladesh and India, and that is much more important compared to the border with Myanmar. And if we go to the next slide, yeah. Now the Rohingya crisis, as you all know, the latest episode of it began in August 2017, and the sheer scale of the genocide that took place there actually shook the world. Now, it has been called by the Holocaust Museum Germany and the Canadian legislators' unanimous opinion. It was called genocide, and Bishop Tutu, as well as Amartya Sen called it slow burning genocide. This has been going on for years, and French President Macron called it industrial scale ethnic cleansing. An UN fact-finding mission on Myanmar called, the genocide as crimes against humanity. So, um, um, next one, please. Yeah, and according to the recent vocabulary used by the UN, it is being called atrocity crimes because atrocity crimes include genocide, crimes against humanity, including ethnic cleansing, and war crimes, including rape and arson attacks. And it is rightly being called by the UN as the atrocity crimes. And attacks on the Rohingyas were well thought out and planned because a very disproportionate use of force actually took place. Why I'm mentioning this? Because it was said that the Rohingyas' own army, um, they attacked some border outposts, 30 border outposts, and in retaliation, the Rohingya villages were burned down. I mean, there is a serious doubt about that among many, whether those who were actually make up or actually the border outposts were attacked by the Rohingyas. However, even if that is true, the kind of response that was generated by the Burmese army, Myanmar army, this was definitely too disproportionate. And that led to the world's most severe refugee emergency. And as I said, it is now 1.12 million refugees living in Bangladesh. Next, please, Victoria. So, next one. Uh, next one, please, Victoria. This is one picture from the satellite imagery of mass destruction in the Rakhine. And it shows that over 210 villages were completely destroyed, um, since August 25, 2007, within a short time. So you can just imagine 210 villages were completely destroyed. This satellite image, the red marked ones, you can see these are burning villages running across the map of the Rakhine state. Next one, please. Then, if we go to the next slide, we find that this is another satellite imagery from earlier arson attacks and on villages in Rakhine state. And Human Rights Watch identified 1,500 buildings destroyed as of December 2016. Between October 9 to December 9, within 3 months, October, November, December, within 2 months, about 1,500 buildings in 2016 were totally destroyed by the arson attacks. Next one, please. And this is another one from the violence that took place in 2012. And it shows the sites, and you can see the small dots, which are quite a lot in number. These were the villages that were, or areas that were affected by the violence in 2012. Next one, please, Victoria. So, we can go on like this, but, because there were major, occurrences in 2008 and before that in 1991, 92. And of course, before that, the first massive influx of refugees came to Bangladesh from the Rakhine state was in 1978. But even before that, we get references when Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, the founding father of Bangladesh, was in power between 1972 and 1975. He also had to take measures to support the Rohingya refugees. And in fact, even before 1971, when Bangladesh was a part of Pakistan, then also there are references of Rohingyas coming from there, maybe in small numbers, to not only to Cox's Bazar, the nearby city, but also up to Chittagong, seeking support, at times begging, because they were so helpless. So there are references and historical evidence to that. So in fact, the crisis began when the military junta took over power in early 60s in Myanmar and began to target the Rohingyas, and take negative actions against them. Then the problem gradually began and it gradually intensified. Yeah. In fact, for our study, we carried out field visits in Rohingya camps in Cox's Bazar area and Cox's Bazar district, and it was, our sister concern, Terracotta Creatives, they their team visited Shahpuri Deep and Teknafufu Jela in Cox's Bazar in the first phase, and in the second phase, Kutupalong camp, which is the largest refugee camp in the world, and the Balukhali, adjacent Balukhali and Palongkhali camps. And, of the 14 men interviewed, 4 were injured, 1 had a leg amputated, 1 was bullet wound, 1 was splinter hit, and 1 had chopped shoulder. These were among the 14 men that our team interviewed. Then next one, please. And findings from the field visit, if we say that of the 14 women that our team interviewed, 1 was aged 21 and she was gang raped. 1 was 45 plus. She had her hand broken as army assaulted her with the gun. And, of the 4 boys that we interviewed, 4 boys and 4 girls, 1 boy witnessed killing himself. And of the 4 girls that we interviewed, 1 was so little a girl, she was only 7 to 8, and she got the lower part of the body burnt, as she, along with a brother, survived a bomb attack on their house when they were asleep. And that bomb attack actually left 7 of her siblings dead. Her parents survived to mourn the death of 7 children, and they could somehow escape and reached Bangladesh. So you can understand the situation which compelled the Rohingyas to leave their country and look for a safer place across the border. Next one, please, Victoria. Now, if we talk about findings from the field visits in the Rohingya camps, very unfortunately, we met 3 girls. 1 was aged 11, another 12, and another 13. And those little girls were all gang raped. And 1 aged 13 stated that she was raped by 8 members of the Burmese military. And they and in the camp, in the month of early September or mid-September, our team actually was there for a month, and they appeared traumatized. And it was whispered in the camp that there was hardly any family who has been able to escape rape, either in their own family or among relatives. But the social stigma has been so strong that it restrained most of them from acknowledging it publicly. Even very unfortunately, even in seeking health support, many have witnessed mass slaughtering and there has been no trauma support. In these circumstances, trauma support is an essential support that should be provided. But Bangladesh was so occupied with providing food and shelter for these people that unfortunately, actually no trauma support could be organized. And all this situation erupted because, the policy of expulsion of the Rohingyas by the state of Myanmar um, was adopted. This policy has been responsible for the atrocity crimes. Next one, Victoria, please. So, if we just have a look at this, map, this is from, say, maybe from November or early December, to cross check, 2017, and um, and uh, and by that time we find that Rohingyas are totally. I mean, it is very difficult to estimate the total number of the Rohingyas because there hasn't been any census among them in Myanmar, and but it is roughly estimated that there are about 2.5 million Rohingyas, and among them by 2017 we found that 200,000 had taken refuge in Saudi Arabia, in UAE 10,000, in Pakistan 350,000, in India 40,000, and in by that time in Bangladesh it was about 1 million, and in Myanmar, I mean in Thailand it was 5,000, in Malaysia it was 150,000, and in Indonesia 1,000. So you can understand what was left or how many Rohingyas were left in their homeland. And we find that it was estimated that it was about 5 to 700,000 Rohingyas were still left, but perhaps there were also another 120,000 Rohingyas as IDPs, internally displaced persons, within the Rakhine state. So we can understand the situation through which the Rohingyas had to undergo. These are the most, um, persecuted people. Rohingyas are the most persecuted people in the world in recent times. Next. Now, what has been responsible for this? This is because of the non or partial recognition of diversity as a state policy. And these two maps show the cross-regional population chart and Myanmar's ethnic mapping. If you look at this second chart, you will find, if you look at the second map, you will find that the center place, that is the white portion where Naypyidaw is shown. This Naypyidaw is the current capital. This white portion is principally Bamar inhabited, Bamar or Burman inhabited. But the surroundings, all bordering areas of Myanmar are basically ethnically diverse, and they are populated by either Shan, Karen, Kachin, Mon, Chin, and others. And towards the and this this situation, I mean, there are a number of, according to they followed a policy of non-recognition till 1982. Then they recognized 8 ethnicities, although they called it 135 ethnicities, but those can be clustered into main 8 ethnicities. So they recognized 8 ethnicities, but they did not recognize the ethnic peoples who were Muslims, and even they have not recognized the Chinese Muslims, though they have a very good relations with China, Myanmar has, but they haven't recognized even the Chinese Muslims. So there has been a policy of non-recognition of, there was initially non-recognition of all ethnicities apart from the majority Bamar population, but subsequently they were forced because there was war all around the mainland. Then, uh, then they were forced to recognize partially some of the major communities, but others are yet to be recognized. Next one, please. Victoria, yeah, thank you. So, Myanmar's policy framework for national integration, excluding the Muslims, and the ultra Bamar nationalism has been responsible for their policy formulation, and along with it, it has been added. I mean, the aggressive Theravada Buddhism, the dominant school of Buddhism in Myanmar, is also responsible for this. So the policy of national integration include excluding Muslims, ultra Burma nationalism, and aggressive Theravada Buddhism. So this aggressive nationalism alongside aggressive religion has become, the main force of expulsion of certain kind of minorities. Next one, please. So, but this was not always the case, because the Federal Union of Burma, which was envisioned by Aung San, leader of interim Burmese government, they understood the need for accommodation of all ethnicities. And on February 12, 1947, uh, uh, Aung San, father of Aung San Suu Kyi, he signed an agreement with the leaders of San, Kachin, and Chin peoples. And that was declared as the Union Day. And in fact, Aung San declared that citizens of frontier areas shall enjoy rights and privileges which are regarded as fundamental in democratic countries. But this was not followed up after the killing of Aung San. Next one, please. In fact, we find that the citizenship law, which was introduced in 1948, that actually gave citizenship to all who had been living in Myanmar from before 1940, and that was the threshold, that was the cutting line. So anybody living in Myanmar permanently from before 1940 was regarded as a citizen according to Citizenship Law of 1948. But the Citizenship Law of 1982 recognized only 8 ethnicities and gave them full citizenship. But it kept the provision of associate citizenship and naturalized citizenship. But they subsequently, and then through that, the process of de-city, making Rohingyas de-citizen, began, because they also introduced in 1989 a national registration card, NRCs, and subsequently introduced in 1995 citizenship security cards. Well, citizenship scrutiny cards, then temporary residency cards, and then again in 2014 began citizenship verification process and began to give national verification cards. And in this process, they actually took away all the documents the Rohingyas had, or almost all the documents that the Rohingyas had, to prove that they had been in this country from a long time. Next one, please. So now, why this vengeance against the Rohingyas, and who are these Rohingyas? What is their identity? So there are 2 theories for this. The one theory says that Rohingyas are a mixed group of people, descendants of Moorish, Arab, Persian traders including Mughal, Turk, Pathan, and Bengalis. I must also mention here, I mean, the majority of the Rohingyas are Muslims, but not all of them are Muslims. There are some Hindu Rohingyas as well, and there are some Christian Rohingyas and Buddhist Rohingyas as well. But they belong to the different school of Buddhism, and that is not accepted in Myanmar. So the first theory says that Rohingyas are a mixed group of people, descendants from Moorish, Arab, and Persian, Bengali, etc. Soldiers come migrants, and it says that they came to Myanmar from between 8th, 9th centuries to 15th centuries, married local women and settled down in the region. And this theory puts them back to at least, say, 500 years, um, to more than 1,000 years, 1,200 years, in there, living in that territory. But the other theory, which is propounded by the military junta, and also very unfortunately looks like that supported by Aung San Suu Kyi, is the theory that Myanmar has no Rohingyas, and the senior army general said that they will not accept this term, and they regard that the Rohingyas were sent by the British to the Rakhine state after colonization of the region after the first Anglo-Burmese War of 1824. So the new citizenship law that has been introduced by the military government, they have made 1824 as the cutoff line for claiming citizenship. They say that anyone who came to Myanmar after 1824, only they can claim to be citizens of Bangladesh or of Myanmar, and anyone who came after that cannot be. So, I mean, that takes them back to their colonial part of their history. But uh, this doesn't tally with the international experience of other world. However, Rohingyas speak Rohingya, an Eastern Indo-Aryan language. Yeah.
You have 5 minutes left, and then we will proceed to the questions. I'm so sorry. It's very interesting.
Okay. Okay. Let
Thank
me
you.
proceed. Okay. Thank you. So I mean, I just want to say that, Bangladesh being a, neighboring country, it has long historical linkage with Arakan state, which is currently the Rohingya region. And I don't have time to talk about that. But I can also say that the situation has been so that the policy of expulsion of the government actually forced them to leave the country. And now there is the issue of, how to deal with the Rohingyas. There are three approaches for Bangladesh. One can be repatriation, and one can be social inclusion, and another one can be third country relocation. Now, repatriation is one issue which Bangladesh has been trying from 1978 onwards, but there has been very, very little success. And on different pretexts, the Myanmar government actually refused to take them back. Like they are asking for papers. So when your house is bombed, when your children's or yourself, part of your family are killed, and when it is, under arson attack, being burnt, you don't have time to collect your identity cards, and rather you run for your life. So that has been the situation. So, now they are asking for all kinds of documents, which is not simply possible for them to give. And then the second option remains, and it looks like that Rohingyas are not going to be taken back by the Myanmar. unless the world community comes together and force them to undertake their own citizens. For Bangladesh, another option has been social inclusion because, to my understanding, at least a large section of the Rohingyas who now claim themselves to be a Rohingyas, because this is a constructed identity. All identities are constructed. So, many of them actually had their origin in Eastern Bengal. So, particularly in the Chittagong region, and they speak Rohingya, which is actually the Chittagonian dialect, largely, at least 70% of it, Chittagonian dialect. So, they have relatives from remote past in this country, or they have had marital relationships um, across the border. So, social inclusion has been one of the options, and Bangladesh has already taken um, several thousands as part of their own, accepted them as part of their population. But it is too much for Bangladesh. So if they cannot be sent back to Myanmar, then perhaps third country relocation is the other option. Why should Bangladesh bear all the burden? Why not other countries of the world, bigger countries with better resources? They should also take the responsibility. Then, if I uh, quickly talk about population pressure, access to services, price hike, and other cases, Rohingyas infiltrating into the nearby indigenous populated areas of Bangladesh. Those are actually having negative impact on the population. So, this has been the situation. It is having a very negative impact locally. Now the government is trying to relocate them in Bhashan Chor, which is um, which is a chor or island in the Bay of Bengal. We have lots of islands, but recently 100,000 Rohingyas has been relocated there, and good facilities have been erected there. So that has been one situation. But let me quickly also say, but this is not being liked by UN and European Union. But Bangladesh perhaps has very little option because the pressure of 1.12 million population on a particular small area where they have outnumbered, doubly outnumbered the local population, it is creating a lot of trouble in the locality. So, my last point would be a quick reflection on the corona situation. Because this is too much overpopulated, they are living in a small area. And though, some of them are sleeping, uh, SLIP, sleeping out of the area and moving into the interior part of Bangladesh. So, and particularly in the Chittagong indigenous inhabited areas, and that is creating a new dimension of the problem. However, the corona situation, there has been so far, according to the last figures that I could get, is from 12th November 2020, and 310 cases have been reported only. But perhaps have they are coming in very less number for testing. This is one, and there has been only 7 death cases reported from corona. But it is feared, particularly among the Bengali community and the indigenous community who live on the edges of the Rohingya camps. They fear that this corona will play havoc in the camps, and they will be also affected. So there is tension along the or on the corona situation in the camps also. So together, if I just make the final statement, I would say that the situation um, uh, which through which the Rohingyas had been forced to go through is, horrendous, and they demand all our attention and care and support. But Bangladesh also has her limitations. So the world community should come forward to share it. And this particular, there should be third country relocation and also special measures taken to fight the COVID-19 in the or among the Rohingyas. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir, for edifying us on this issue, which has been a major concern for quite a long now. It was truly thought-provoking and something to work upon, and we are very sorry for the time. It was really very educative and interesting. It was a nice research. Now I will invite Professor Sanchukta Bhattacharya to join us. We have some questions for both of you that we would like to answer, like both of you, if it is possible. There is none. So the first question is from Devasis Kumar Dutta. It was for ma'am, I think. Is there any data of the total number of the migrant workers? Is any registration done for them to provide them with different benefits,
Yes, in fact, what I mentioned was that immigrant workers, they make up about half the population of India. There is no data. There is no proper data regarding who is going where or anything like that. But it is the census of India. Basically, they try to make a list of people who are not living where they were born or the state where they were born. So through this, they are trying to do that. Now, basically, according to the kind of exponential growth in numbers, there should be about 600 million as of 2020. But the official census figure of 2011 was something like 400 and something million people. So 600 million, if you go by the increases around now. So, but there is no proper data except the census, which basically has a very broad definition of migrant. That anybody who is enumerated in a place in which they are not born, or that which would make even me basically a migrant. So that is not a proper way of doing it. Now, there is nothing to do with, there is no data on migrant labor, migrant workers, especially the semi-skilled, the low-skilled. So it is estimated there are about 140 to 150 million. Now, there was just one act in 1979 regarding pay, regulation of pay, wages, accommodation, but it was not implemented. In fact, I myself did not know about it until, in fact, I was asked to speak at the seminar when I found that there was one basically law, which obviously, like most laws in India, are not very effective. Laws of this kind, they're not very effective. Now, after the pandemic, after the humanitarian crisis, the government has come up with various kind of yojanas. Well, part of Atmanirbhar Bharat, some of them are, and some of them are not. Some of them were temporary, some are medium, and some basically are long-term. Now, the long-term ones is basically the one where they are planning to give housing or that as such for migrant workers at a cheap rate, built on a private-public partnership basis. And this is supposed to be completed by the end of 2021, but I don't know whether it's begun. I don't think so. There's nothing working in any case. The money appears to have been allocated, but as we see there's been so much of political discussion on allocation of funds and spending and whether actually money is being spent or whether it's being really allocated. The other thing is the One Nation, One Ration Card scheme, which is a long-term scheme, which basically if you have a ration card here, say in Kolkata, the same ration card will apply to you. I mean, you can apply that in Delhi, which you can't do now. if you have a ration card in a village, well, it's not applicable in Kolkata. Now they're trying to make this into a kind of one nation, one ration card thing. Now, this is problematic. They're supposed to have completed 83% of the work by this month, but I don't think they've begun. Not yet, all right, as such. There are about 64 million beneficiaries supposed to be. I mean, those who get this kind of, ration. But, well, it's not going to reach them right now. They're supposed to complete it by March 2021, but I don't think it has begun. So there are schemes which are long-term. The short-term ones are basically giving money, funds, setting up portals for movement of workers. But the workers whom they're supposed to benefit, they don't know about these. In fact, I've spoken to quite a few of them. Actually, here, those who have come back on the way. In fact, I mean, these are relatives, or as such, of our domestic workers who went to Delhi to work, and now they're back here again, going back to their villages. So they kind of passed through here. This was a corridor. Now, speaking to them, what they said was that they did not get ration, they did not get the free food, etc. They got some in the camps, or where in fact free food was given. They did not know whether it was the government or the NGOs or individuals who were giving this kind of food. But the government was supposed to provide food. Now, they said they did not get any benefits. They didn't get any health care. They didn't get anything, really. So short-term benefits, a lot of money has been allocated, or at least the government has announced a lot of money. But whether it has been spent properly, there's not much transparency. The PM CARES Fund is there, but we do not know exactly. In fact, our government here, the TMC government, has been questioning whether this money has come through. State governments also have been allocating funds, but then the central government says that the money is not going through, and there's cut money and all that. So the whole thing has been politicized at the short-term level. I just hope that the long-term level works.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. We are moving to our last questions. This is for Professor Mesbah Kamal by Kartik Sapui. In Rohingya refugees, many times they are in antisocial and illegal activity which are harmful in mainland people. Any military activities are taking place against Myanmar in this situation? What is your opinion on this?
Well, thank you very much for the question. I mean, there are complaints like this, and there is a general complaint that Rohingyas are somewhat rowdy and they have a linkage with the militants. But, Kofi Annan carried out a study on behalf of the UN, of course, together with the help of the of Myanmar government. He carried out a study, and it showed the kind of deprivation that the Rohingya people have been going through. You will be amazed to know that when they came to Bangladesh as refugees, Bangladesh government found out that they do not know anything about contraceptives. It is not there at all among them. This is because they don't have the knowledge, they don't have the education, and they don't have the basic education. There was no school, no colleges, no question of universities. There was no mother tongue based education. There were hardly a few, religious institutions, maybe mosque-based institutions made by themselves, giving them elementary education, that kind of thing. And there was no support for over, say, from 1960s onwards. So going back to about 60 years, they have been without any governmental support. I don't know how much it was before that, but they have been strictly without any governmental support for more than 60 years. So it has played havoc with their lives. So, when there is no education, when there is no job, when there is they don't have enough land to cultivate, in this situation, you know, there is resource constraint and there is competition for acquiring resources. So you have to analyze, even if you have to analyze their poverty and you have to analyze their situation once you make a statement about them. So well, uh, in Bangladesh, where in a very small area, in one small part called Ukhia and Teknaf, two sub districts, or rather, I should say, two blocks of Indian standard. You know, they are mainly concentrated. Of course, you know, uh, there is drugs, and they are carriers of drugs. But they are not allowed to work in Bangladesh officially. They haven't been recognized as the refugees. So they have to be confined to their camps, and what they have got to do in 24 hours of the day, they have no work, nothing to do, and idle brains are devil's workshops. And they also, though they are not yet in food crisis, but this may not be the food that they like to eat, because these are tin foods supplied by the international communities. So this food may not be liked by them because it doesn't go with their food history and food culture. So in this situation, to buy the food that they like, they need to sell their foods illegally, and they need to go out to work. So in this situation, there has been they have, some of them have resorted to illegal means, including drugs. And but I must also say that Myanmar army runs factories of drugs alongside the border, and Bangladesh is a major client, and it comes up to the capital. So, and of course, some of the Rohingyas are carriers. But there are reports of that, and there has been internal killings. There has been more than 40 cases of death by internal fights among themselves in the camps so far in last 3 years. But these are negative things. But it has not so far come out of the camp. And there has been one major occasion when Rohingya involvement was reported, like the attacks on the Buddhist monasteries. Yeah, yeah,
Thank you, sir.
by the by the Muslim fundamentalists, and Rohingyas took part in that uh, in Cox's Bazar. That has been reported, but so far the government has been able to control it. But we have to answer the question. My summation is that we have to understand their situation, and we have to analyze it sociologically, their acts and deeds. Otherwise, we will misunderstand them. Thank you very much. Where is Victoria?
In fact, since she's not here, I can just an incident in Kerala. I came across some Rohingyas. They were acting as boatmen. They have these, lovely houseboats in the backwaters. Now, since I am Bangali, so basically, these people are talking in in some very strange dialect, but I could make out words. So I asked them directly, so where are you from? They said, we are from here. I said, you can't be from here. You're not Keralite. And then I spoke in Bengali. And, they turned out to be Rohingya. So these are illegal immigrants over here.
Yeah, that is right. Thank you, ma'am. It shows you are still live.
Can't appear.
Okay.
I don't know.
Thank you very much, ma'am. We should be in touch.
Say thank you, Vaita Vishek.
Thank you, ma'am. So we can
you again. Bye-bye.
They left.
Okay. So I would now like to call Mr. Abhishek Bastriar, a student of
And video.
Human Rights Department, to provide a vote of thanks to Dr. Misbah Kamal and Professor Sanjukta Bhattacharya. Abhishek.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
It's my privilege to propose the vote of thanks on behalf of this esteemed institution. We want to express our gratitude to our eminent lecturers, Professor Sanjukta Bhattacharya, Professors of International Relations, and Professor Misbah Kamal, Professor of History, who has spared their precious time for us and graced this webinar with their presence. It gave deep insights into the topic and also revealed some interesting facts. I'm pretty sure the precious knowledge that we have received will definitely help us in our studies and future. Once again, I would like to thank Professor Sanjukta Bhattacharya and Professor Misbah Kamal for taking out time for their busy schedule and enlightening us with their knowledge. Thank you so much.
Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
It's been wonderful seeing Professor Kamal again. We met last in Lipi Ghosh's seminar.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. It's nice meeting you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am, for being with us here today. It has been a privilege from hearing from you all. Thank you so much.
We'll
So
leave the
now,
studio.
yes, ma'am. So now let's moving on to the technical session. I would like to request Dr. Payal Rai Chaudhary Dutt, the coordinator of the Department of Human Rights and Human Development of Rabindra Bharati University, to provide the welcome address to Professor Michael George O. Hayes from the University of Mahidol, Thailand. Over to you, ma'am. Ma'am, please turn on your
Yes,
camera.
thank you so much, Upasna. I know we are running a little behind time, but just by way of a two-line, Professor Michael George O. Hayes is an expert on the wide and varied areas of international human rights law. And as a teacher, his classes on refugee and migration law are legendary. Students looking to earn extra credits at the postgraduate or at the doctorate level will flock to those classes, necessarily opt for his classes as ever. So you will normally have a class brimming with students as Dr. Mike Hayes, as he's fondly known, goes about bringing alive international treaties play out in the backdrop of geopolitical factors that interact with refugee, IDP, and migration issues on that white board with the humble marker, black marker in hand. So needless to say, it is a delight to present to our panelists today, Professor Michael George O. Hayes, and indeed very honored to be able to welcome you again, Mike, to chair this session. Over to you, and thank you very much indeed.
Here I am. You can hear me okay?
Yes, sir. Welcome, sir, once again to the International Webinar on Human Rights and Vulnerable Groups. Hope you're fine. Okay.
Yep, I'm good. So
Yes, sir.
shall we'll start? I'll
Yes,
just
sir.
a couple of words before we start the session, and we'll start with the first paper from Sukanya in a second. But it's just
Sure,
it's
sir.
a good day. It's a good day to be doing this because, as you all probably know, it's Human Rights Day. So it's the 72nd anniversary of the UDHR today. You've probably talked about that before. And in one area where there's been more development than most in terms of human rights is migration, because the UDHR didn't really have a lot about migration, but we're seeing more and more treaties and more work in this area. As we just had in that previous panel on the Rohingya, that's probably the biggest migration event, probably in the world, definitely in the region. We have at least, between 1 and 2 million people displaced. And so given that context, let's start with the papers. So how do we do that? You're going to bring on...
You can also, sir, if you wish, you can also call them.
Okay, so let's have the first paper from Ms. Sukanya Banerjee on COVID-19 and climate refugees. You'll have about 7 minutes.
Yes. Am I audible?
Hi.
Yeah, thank you.
So,
am I audible?
well, and you can start.
Yeah. Yeah, okay, thank you. Is my presentation visible?
Yep, there it is. We can see it.
Okay, thank you. So, hello and a very good afternoon to everyone. I'm Sukarna Banerjee and I'm a guest faculty at the Department of Human Rights and Human Development in RBU. And I'd like to thank both our department as well as the Department of Disability Studies for organizing this international webinar. And also a special thanks to the students for organizing and making such an efficient effort in making this a success. Now, focusing on my paper, which is focusing on the climate refugees and their plight and how it has increased during the COVID-19 situation. So firstly, let's talk about climate change. What is climate change? So according to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change of 1992, we know that climate change is a change in climate which can be attributed to anthropogenic activities, and it alters the composition of the global atmosphere, and that actually adds to the existing natural climate vagaries which can be observed over comparable time periods. Now, this change in the climate leads to certain impacts. Now, these are effects created by climate change and extreme weather events on the natural and human systems, as mentioned in the 5th assessment report of the International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And these impacts can be seen in the form of physical impacts such as floods, droughts, sea level rise, desertification, and other such impacts. And as an aftermath of these different extreme weather events, we can see that there are other impacts such as loss of lives, livelihoods, impacts on the ecosystems, economies, societies, cultures, services, as well as on their infrastructure. So when we talk about vulnerability and vulnerable populations, the populations which are predisposed to be adversely affected and they are susceptible to harm, and also they lack the capacity to cope and adapt, are known as vulnerable populations. Now, we know that the extreme weather events such as desertification, cyclones, sea level rise, floods, droughts, they lead to displacement of millions of people. So recently, the World Bank has actually come up with some data which says 143 million people across the globe are going to be moving out of their homes because of these extreme weather events. However, I would like to focus on climate change-induced sea level rise that leads to coastal flooding, coastal erosion, and submergence of the low-lying coastal areas, and it impacts the people who are living in these low-lying areas, low-lying deltas of the world, as well as the small island nations. And these people tend to suffer from the vulnerability that we just discussed above. And these people are known as climate refugees or environmental refugees. They're also known as environmental migrants because their migration is not migration by choice, but by compulsion of the encroaching sea that keeps coming into their homes and into their lives. Now, COVID-19, as we know, is the first documented coronavirus pandemic in history, and the World Health Organization declared it as a public health emergency of international concern. And as a result of that, in order to contain this deadly virus, different countries have come up with lockdowns, quarantines, social, physical distancing norms, and other precautionary measures. And as a result of that, it has actually impacted the global economy. In fact, The chief economist of the International Monetary Fund has called it the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression of 1929. However, this impact of COVID-19 on the climate refugees is even far adverse. I would like to draw your attention to two examples of the extreme weather events. One is the super cyclone Amphan that struck eastern Indian state West Bengal and Bangladesh between 16th May and 21st May of 2020, and the other one being Typhoon Goni that struck Philippines on the 26th of October 2020. And this led to some adverse reactions. Firstly, the relief operations were hit because of the lockdown, and also there was weak disaster preparedness by the authorities, which also affected these vulnerable people. And there was inadequate infrastructure to maintain social distancing in the temporary shelters for the displaced population. Also, it was noticed that there was a shortfall in meeting medical and quarantine needs, especially for persons with disabilities. And also, especially in the Sundarbans of India, we have seen a spike in child marriage and human trafficking of girls and women. And also, even after a few months of the super cyclone, there is a lack of access to safe drinking water, and an agricultural crisis is prevailing over there as the saline water has encroached into the cultivable land. Also, we have noticed as humans are encroaching into the habitats of the animals, the tiger attacks have increased because humans are trying to fish in those habitats and also collect honey. And also, it has been noticed that there is an increase in poverty, weak health systems, and increased conflict over these limited resources that are available. So, unfortunately, the 1951 UN Refugee Convention gives legal recognition to only those people who are fleeing persecution and not to climate refugees. Even the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees refuses to recognize this particular term of climate refugee. And also, similar approach is taken by the Nansen Initiative as well as the New York Declaration for Refugees and Migrants. But they do recognize the people who are getting displaced across borders because of climate change. And in fact, the Global Compact on Refugees are accepting and acknowledging the fact that this climate change induced displacement is on the rise. So the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, he has himself acknowledged that there is a protection gap in the international system. And also, I feel it is high time that the term climate refugees gets integrated in the 1951 Refugee Convention. And if that poses a problem, one could think of drafting and adopting a new legally binding international convention or agreement that can actually hold the state parties ratifying this convention to be accountable to the vulnerable group of climate refugees. And also, it's very, very imperative that the existing policies and action plans are implemented properly at the national, state, and local levels. And also, proper implementation of those mitigative and adaptive strategies take place, such as improved early warning systems, disaster preparedness, planned retreat and relocation and resettlement of these climate refugees, offering them skills, looking at these strategies with a gendered lens, and also mobilizing emergency funds to help these vulnerable people. I would like to end by drawing your attention to this photograph. This photograph was taken by me in 2018 at Boatkhali in Shagor Island in the Indian Sundarbans. And this, and you can see there is on the right hand side a building which is the school, remains of a school rather, in the distance. Now in 2020, if we go back to this place, we will not be able to see the remains of this village anymore, but it's just full of water. This place has been encroached by the Bay of Bengal. So I think it's very important that we acknowledge the fact that climate change induced sea level rise is not a myth but a reality, and we should try and acknowledge it and address this situation to help the climate refugees. Thank you.
Great, thanks for that. That was a really interesting talk. And I think there's lots of interesting debates going on, particularly in South Asia, around the ratification of the Refugee Convention and the challenges towards that. And also there's interesting debates going on about how we should be addressing climate refugees, whether there should be a whole new treaty, which is always going to be challenging, or whether there should be a reinterpretation of the definition of the refugee in the 1951 Convention, because there is room for adapting that definition. But still, there's no, these are two areas of debate. But great, thanks for that. So let's move on to our next speaker, who is Ajit Kumar Babu, who's going to be talking about, again, COVID-19 and reverse migration. So welcome, Ajit, and you're welcome to start your presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, sir. With your kind permissions, I would like to start my presentation. My name is Ajit Kumar Babu, and I am a PhD scholar at National Institute of Advanced Studies, Bangalore, India. So, but before that, I would like to thank the Department of Human Rights and Human Development and the Department of Disability Studies of Rabindra Bharati University for giving me this opportunity to talk on this aspect of this migrant workers. So, next slide, please. So I will talk on the COVID-19 redundancy of the marketable reverse migrations and redundancy of the marketable skills of the migrant workers. So before that, I would like to give the background where I have placed my research questions. So if we look at the macro level of structural change, then the most important structural change that we can see in the occupation structure is there is a movement away from agriculture, that the agriculturalists have been moving away from agriculture, and this phenomena has been observing from the times of independence. But the magnitude of the change, like there is a large number of the people that they have leaving agriculture in the recent decade. In a recent work by Deepak Kumar Behera in 2015, he has pointed out that the magnitude of the movement away from agriculture is about 4.7% in the 3 decades from the time of independence, but which has increased to around 23% after 1983. This structural change, which is leading to a large set of the people that they have lived away from their occupation, that is from agriculture, has also been seen when we look at the gap between the contributions of agriculture to our GDP and the contributions of the labor or the dependency of the workforce on the agriculture. So if we look at this figure, then the contributions of agriculture to GDP has been declined from 41.1% to 14.1% between 1972-73 to 2011-12. And on the other side, the contributions of employment, the workforce engaged in agriculture has been declined from 73.9% to 48.9% between the same period. And the last set of the people, those they have moved away from agriculture, also observed when we look at the change or the gap between the contributions of agriculture to GDP and also the contributions of the rural populations to the total populations in India. So why this structural change is an important phenomenon, particularly in this migration context, because this lead to the different forms of the transformations, and that different form of the transformations leading to different forms of the migrations or movement away from the village or the movement away from the different occupations. So why it is important now? Because in census data 2001 to 2011, a study conducted in 2017 that has pointed out that 8.9 million farmers have moved away from agriculture in between this 10 years of time period. Though this process has been started in 1991, but during that period, though the main agricultural workers left agriculture, but the marginal workers entered into the agriculture, and that can coincide, and it was not catches the attention in that particular time. But during this last census decade, when this last set of the people, those they left agriculture, then this phenomena becomes an important phenomena to understand. Next slide, please. So what are the transformations pattern that has been observed from this macro level of structural changes? So one of the study conducted by Dr. Sumedha Bazar, so she pointed out that there are different patterns that has been emerged from this last set of the structural changes that has been happening in agriculture. So she has mapped 4 patterns or 4 patterns of transformations. Though these patterns are not mutually exclusive, she has called these patterns as movement away from agriculture to rural non-farm activities. And these rural non-farm activities are not confined with the rural areas only. It can be the occupations, non-farm occupations are located around the rural areas. Then the movement from rural to urban areas by sharing different forms of distance with the place of origin and host place, and become marginal, and that can form the group of the circular migrant. They work some months of a year in agriculture and some months of a year in non-agricultural activities, and in most vulnerable conditions they can again enter into the agriculture. Next slide, please. So these patterns have changed because of this outbreak of this COVID-19 pandemic, when a large set of the migrant workers, they walk back to the place of origin through this reverse process of migration. Next slide, please. So in this context, the two questions that has emerged: what is the influence of the reverse migrations after the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic on the redundancy of the marketable skills of the migrant workers, what they have learned at the workplace, and that has a market value at that particular workplace? And what is the associations between the redundancy of marketable skills of migrant workers and their vulnerability? Next slide, please. So to address these questions, so I take some parts of my PhD thesis field work, which I have conducted in a purposely selected village in Jharkhand, which was selected based on a previous survey conducted at a host place and at Bangalore, where a survey of some workers in a construction site were surveyed, and that was followed by a tracking survey at the origin place. And from those sets of villages, I have selected one village purposely based on a criterion that maximum number of the peoples are working in the non-agricultural sectors. And during the survey, it was found that 8.4% of the peoples are now in agricultural activities in this particular village, and others are in the non-agricultural activities, or they are, and some of them are unemployed or not working populations. So in that, before going to that village, we also mapped the long-term trend in the occupational patterns, and there also we found a temporary movement there, like in some years, decades, people have moved away from agriculture. Yeah,
you have 1 minute left.
Okay, so we conducted a survey there, and then we found that each contribute different forms of the different forms of migration from that village. Next slide, please. So three sets of my migrations we have categorized there. Like one is on long distance, one is commuting distance, and other is intermediate distance. Like by taking distance as a criterion, and they are facilitating this process through the social network. And the main motive for their migrations is to gain in real terms. Next slide, please. So because of this COVID-19 pandemic, when they come back, their skills, what they have learned, get redundant at the origin place, because when they change their place, the exchange value and the use value of a skills get redundant or unnecessary at a particular place, because it lose its purchasing power, and it use its utility at the origin place. Next slide, please. Next slide. So how the redundancy of the marketable skills increase the vulnerability of the migrant workers? When they come back to their village, the first thing is that they lose their earnings, they lose their employment, and they become unemployed, underemployed, and disguised unemployed. And then now they are returning into the agriculture, and loss of redundancy skills leading to forcing them to change their occupations, which has the marketable value at the origin place. And also that leads to an additional cost, because they now are need to or forced to learn the new skills to observe at that origin place, which takes time and additional cost in terms of the less wages and the wages that they have learned, or the more wages that they were getting against their acquired marketable skills. Yeah.
Sir, we are very sorry, but you need to conclude. Yeah. If you can go to the conclusion.
Next slide, please. So these are the differences that I have mentioned. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for that, Ajit. I think it's it's a really interesting and important topic because we're seeing very similar issues in different countries. Say, like, for example, in Australia, which is very developed and has a large agricultural industry, but because it's all done by migrant workers, these are international migrant workers who can't get into the country now. There's a whole phenomena of fruit just not being picked or stuff not being harvested. And in Thailand, we have another dynamic where the government just tends to rely on the rural areas to be like a sponge. And so in times of crisis, they just expect people to leave the urban centres and go back to the rural areas. And it seems like that may have been a bit of a phenomena that you're looking at, how people just have to return to the countryside and, get out there living because the government is not protecting their jobs, not protecting their interests, and relying on what may be one of the more poorer sectors of the community to act as sort of a form of social welfare. Is that the case?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Means after coming back to their origin, particularly after this COVID-19 pandemic, when they come back to their place of origin, they lose their earnings, they lose their employment, and their skills, what they have acquired at that workplace, get redundant or unnecessary at that origin place, because they cannot extend that skills at that origin place, and that increases their vulnerability.
Great, thanks. So that was a really, really interesting talk and good points there. Now, where's my paper? So
thank you, sir.
We have a very busy schedule. We now have to move on to the next speaker, Tania Banerjee, who's going to be talking about the politics of migration through the lens of female migrants, through the lens of women migrants. So Tania, you can start. Welcome.
Yeah, hello, sir. Good afternoon, everyone. And I thank the presenters for their interesting papers. So the topic of my paper is the politics of migration through the lens of women migrants. So in the COVID crisis, we have seen that how these policies for the migrants have been insufficient in tackling their issues. Especially when we talk about migration, it has always been seen through a very economic framework. And the women migrants' subjectivities and experiences have often been neglected. Recently, we have seen growth from rural to urban migration, especially due to the feminization of labor and the shanty conditions of the living, the resources, the lack of resources. It kind of exacerbates the vulnerabilities of the women migrants. So, firstly, I would say that these women migrants, they are doubly discriminated, firstly, as a category of women, and secondly, as their category of being a migrant. So this paper, which I would talk about, it revolves around that how politics is often defined when the migrants are partially accommodated in the ambit of the law. And this paper also seeks to put forward a concept of emotional citizenship, which claims to bridge the gap between the law and the everyday struggle that a woman migrant undergoes. So as we see that migrants are often, they serve as a bridge between the host city and the native place, and their everyday strategies involves negotiation, resistance, and persistence. An important question which can be delved around or delve deeper is that how these migrants' treatment is tied to the ethnic, religious, or cultural conceptions of citizenship. And the migrants, they highlight the tension between the policies and the practices that aim to build a democratic political community and those that seek to make such a community bounded or exclusive. In the cities, we see that women are often living in miserable conditions and they are employed in the unorganized sector, such as we see women work in salons or in beauty parlors, in restaurants as waitresses and as ushers and as assistants in large stores. So here we see that this the very concept of migrants, and especially for women migrants, it emerges from the condition of dispossession or dislocation as well as disempowerment. So these internal migrants, they highlight the changing nature of citizenship in India, who can now or from they are now actually excluded from the set of from the legal Indian citizens. So in practice, migrants find it difficult to actually put their name in the documents because they do not have any ration card. And even if they do so or they want to find out about the procedure, it is difficult for them to do so because most of them don't know, unaware of the procedures. So while analyzing the very concept of the citizenship regimes regarding the migrants, it is important to understand that we put them in context or this concept in relation to legal status, their rights, and identity. So Sadiq has termed this concept as blurred membership, which is to designate that the existence of the long-time resident members of a polity, citizens by birth who are unrecognized by agents of the state because of their lack of official standard documentation. Not just this, but the freedom of movement is often restricted for the women because with such policies at hand, they often have to rethink about their decision to move, where freedom of movement is a fundamental right in the Indian Constitution. So when we see that, first of all, what we need to cater to is most of these social security measures, they are framed with the assumption that these migrants are static. Whereas we have a large number of migrants who are seasonal as well as short duration or cyclic migrants who are present in the country. And this wage labor has actually become the basis of social exclusion and differential citizenship. So, this exclusion process, which is embedded in the institutional process of citizenship, is manifested via differential categories and the lived experiences of citizenship. Not just social rights, economic rights, but political rights are often mm, they are neglected, or the migrants are deprived of the political citizenship as well, because political citizenship, it demands enumeration as well as identification of the citizens, and the voting ability is itself as it is an expression of the citizenship rights. So when like the women migrants, they're put outside the ambit of the electoral process, and they face the repression from the machinery. Also, there's a constant police surveillance which is going on, so it increases their vulnerability as citizens and as migrants. So, a prerequisite for enumeration as a citizen voter is residence. And for migrants, this very category or this very situation of residence is something which is negligible or absolutely absent in their lives. More of the coming problems or the policies which are coming in, and the current situation is that the present crisis has brought into light the blurred boundaries between the legal and the illegal. So the state gains its legitimacy through the regulation of the illegal, and such regulation is evidently outside of the law and involves the use of the discretionary powers of the state of the power by the state officials. So in this manner, the state retains power, and it kind of increases its dependability, or rather, I would say that increases the dependency of the society on them. So one of the studies by Veena Das, she clearly shows that. So her ethnographic work shows the low-income neighborhood in Delhi, and she explains that how the regulation of the illegal, it often transforms into negotiations involving the petty bribes or votes or other
You
services
have
that are linked.
1 minute left. You have only
Okay,
1 minute.
thank you. To the underlife of politics. So, in this context, I see that a lack of sociological framework is actually uh, uh, like apart from the courts, there's and the economic framework. We need to understand that we need to put an emotional framework into understanding the lives of the women migrants, because their everyday resistance is in the form of solidarity, survival, and negotiations. And what I would argue is that despite official discourses and policies promoting equality in the polity, analyzing the emotional negotiations experienced by migrants, it illuminates why the migrants might feel that they lack full citizenly recognition. While making articulation of claims for political and social acceptance, being emotionally involved as like being emotionally involved as citizen is equally important. Finally, I would like to conclude by saying that I argue that due to the burden of the obligation put by the state, they cannot put themselves as political subjects. I further argue that the state is ubiquitous in every sphere of life, but overlooks the multi-layered identities of the women migrants who belong to the different sections of the society. In contemporary times, a bar-coded relationship between the state and the citizens, it is often characterized by surveillance and subjection and control. But the various instructions of the state is often followed by these migrants with the hope of receiving those facilities, but they're often negligible or they're often oblivious to the privacy question which is associated with this. So, lastly, I would conclude that the migrants are under the purview of the state policies and the socio-economic practices, but they are regularly demarcated outside the ambit of the citizenship. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Tanya, for that interesting paper. It is really useful to try and explore more closely, as you've done, this kind of intersectionality of migration and gender and economics and citizenship and those kinds of things. Because I think, as you highlighted, that they are all adding and kind of complement each other in disempowering female migrants. So I just assume you're talking about international migrants into India and not what we call it like internal migrants as the previous paper. But I think it's also important that often we tend to forget that the citizenship laws tend to be gendered as well, that for men citizenship is much more accessible, whereas for women, and particularly women migrants, it is more challenging. And I assume that's the case in India. Is that the case, Tanya?
So obviously, like this paper was mostly focused on the internal migrants, but also when I took up the emotional framework, it's for the migrants all over the world who are there. As long as citizenship is concerned, I think the very aspect of citizenship or the state is very gendered and it's very patriarchal, because a lot of the people who are unable to access the citizenship through because women are not considered as economic subjects, or they are not even as subjects or even as citizens. They are considered as the residuary citizens or the secondary citizens. So I think that is one of the major reasons why citizenship still has been a kind of a complex question for women, and especially migrants as such. So that is one thing. And with class and the caste coming up in the Indian context, I think it becomes really more interdependent and very dubious kind of a category.
Yeah, and I think that's where the concept of effective citizenship, which tends to be used more now, that in kind of traditional human rights, we talk about de facto and de jure citizenship, like you either have citizenship by law or by not. We know that often the kind of the privilege of citizenship can be withheld, even though you legally should get access to it. So it's better to kind of conceptualize this as how effective is your citizenship. Does the state recognize you? Does it kind of see you as a citizen? And does it grant you your rights as a citizen? Because it may just be ineffective that you should be getting that citizenship and you're not because of gender, caste, and so on. I'm afraid we have to wrap it up.
Yeah, just one point, sir. Also, like, who decides the citizenship? That is one of the important questions we have to form, because those in power and the policies which are framing and the very concept of citizenship, like those who are regulating or implementing, we don't see women representatives as such. So that representation is, as Anne Phillips would say, that representation is an important factor in considering how we go about it. So that is one. The politics of presence, actually. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Good point. And that, citizenship laws have always been written by men, and that's why they tend to favour men. And also, of course, you've got the whole other case ongoing now in Manipur. I think it's the Manipur state where you have this kind of redrafting of the citizenship laws of the various state laws and the problems of potential statelessness there. But we'll have to leave that, and now we'll invite the next speaker, who is, thank you very much, Tanya, Abhijan Guha, who's going to talk about the nation and migrant workers in a Keynesian tailspin. I like the title.
Thank you, sir.
Abhijan.
Am I audible?
Yes, you can start.
Okay. Thank you so much. Very good afternoon to one and all present here. And since we are running out of time, I barely have 7 minutes, so I'm going to brush through the details and focus on the key issue areas. So I'm focusing more on the economic dimension because, as per the classical Marxian analogy, we know the base superstructure analogy. So I think that the architecture of rights and liberties are epiphenomenal as far as the modes and relations of production are concerned, even now. So putting things into perspective, the pandemic has gesticulated a tectonic shift in the constellation of powers, altering global leadership footprints, exacerbating pre-existing geopolitical conflicts, and catalyzing a snowball effect of comprehensive economic debilitation, crystallizing the language of securitization and the binarization of us versus them, while restricting the political imagination to the monopolized ontological domination of nation-states in a hyper-transformative world order without structural predictability. Against a dystopian backdrop, India has been plagued with multifaceted challenges, from skyrocketing unemployment, demand and public debt crisis, to the predicament of labor migration characterized by a plethora of economic, sociological, political and humanitarian ramifications. The rudimentary objective as of now is to offer a normative teleological insight into the de facto migrant labor crisis in India, while holistically juxtaposing myriad ontological and epistemological indicators with an emphasis on the economic and human rights dimension of pandemic-induced intrastate and interstate labor migration. I have managed to assess a series of macro-societal and cyclical developments ranging from push and pull factors of labor migration, the reactionary decision-making of the political establishment, to the repercussions of cyclical lockdowns and the lockdowns, and the attitudinal and ideational component of the social order towards migrant laborers has been highlighted. When a contagion has propelled systemic racial discrimination, cognitive biases, ethnocentrism, xenophobia, and institutionalized otherization vis-a-vis the instruments of statecraft during the peak rise of mobilization on the closures of borders. While the notion of physical and social distancing is antithetical to the rationale behind society and politics as collective decision-making arenas, the current health crisis has compelled to turn the lens back on the struggles and vast array of insecurities of migration and settlement. Additionally, I've tried to throw some light on the immediate contours and trajectories of forced and voluntary labor migration, the process of assimilation and acculturation, how networks of kinship ties that migrant laborers bring with them shape the magnitude of internal and international migration by adding to the changing cultural demography. I've managed to make a series of speculative policy prescriptions as a prophylactic against human rights violations, aiming at advancing an ethos of care and mutual respect macroscopically. Now, going to the remedial measures, the solutions and strategies part, I think it is important to navigate and prudently deal through the challenges like lockdowns, quarantine, and social distancing, and continue with relief response to the implementation of various activities like prevention programs to frontline leaders, doing community support by helping with dry ration and relief, supporting medical facilities and hospitals with adequate measures, especially during a pandemic of this magnitude, where all systems and mechanisms are disrupted due to a plethora of challenges. Now, as per the International Labour Organization's policy recommendations, gender-sensitive rights-based policies and measures can help to prevent human and labor rights abuses in the immediate term, reduce the recovery costs for essential services and businesses when the economy will rebound, and preserve the livelihood and social benefits of migrant laborers and their families in the medium to long term. The ILO has recommended voluntary and active cooperation with ministries of labor and all relevant ministries and stakeholders, and has advocated an inclusive, pluralistic approach in including women, minorities, and migrant workers in national COVID-19 response strategies, which will ensure better protection of the health and safety of all migrant laborers and frontline workers and prevent the spread of disease. Inclusion of migrant laborers will help to mitigate the risk that the migrants will be left further behind once the pandemic subsides. 3 areas of action are rudimentary, namely the inclusion of migrant laborers in national COVID-19 response mechanisms and strategies, bilateral cooperation between places or states of origin and destination, social dialogue and full involvement of employers and workers organizations in the development of COVID-19 responses. And these are also relevant to inform responses in the protection of refugees and other displaced persons. Migrants workers' inclusion in the national COVID-19 policy responses can help to ensure the effective realization of equality, social justice, and strengthen the dimension of labor and human rights properly. In this context, eminent developmental economist John Dress has recommended the consolidation and expansion of the existing public distribution system in India vis-a-vis the enormous supply of surplus food stock reserves, and in order to deal effectively with the present humanitarian, health, and economic catastrophe, he has suggested that it is very urgent to expand the employment opportunities under the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act as soon as possible to generate large-scale employment, ensuring that the disadvantaged and vulnerable people have adequate access to essential resources and basic civic amenities. As elderly people, even among the most disadvantaged migrant laborers, are the most vulnerable segment of the health crisis, many of them being impoverished, many of them are being widows, women who are dependent on daily wage earning migrant laborers for their survival. Social security measures and pre-existing welfare and pension schemes in the Indian states ought to be consolidated and expanded immediately. Despite reforming the PDS, existing income guarantee acts or social security and welfare schemes and pensions, there are still a significant number of people who fall through the cracks and are vulnerable to hunger. And for those people, it is necessary to develop emergency facilities like community kitchens in villages or Anganwadi centers in rural areas, And it's not impossible to organize these provisions, as there is a very functional school meal program in every government school in India, coupled with feeding programs in childcare centers. It is necessary to immediately add some kind of relief component to these pre-existing programs and governmental schemes so that everyone can be relieved out of hunger and destitution. The presence of some foundational social security programs in India could be utilized in good effect in this ongoing crisis to protect the most vulnerable section from malnourishment, hunger, destitution, and it requires quick action, fair amount of financial resources primarily from the central government, and effective cooperation from the local community and administration. Macroscopically, there is an urgent need to amalgamate and unite the foundations of social security and healthcare system in India, as the nation has been paying a very big price for chronic underinvestment in public health for several decades. There has to be much greater investment in healthcare and improving the structural architecture of the medical establishment, and a decisive move towards the principle of universal healthcare, and that is healthcare is a primary social responsibility and not a fixed subject for private profit making.
Mr. Ravi,
yeah, I am concluding.
Only 1 minute left.
By creating sustainable income generation, rural-urban continuum, focusing on employability and entrepreneurship, disaster preparedness, a robust architectonic system can be created to tide over the crisis. Several models and paradigms should emerge at the local levels to stop forcible migration, support lives and livelihoods to bright opportunities. Tangible and dynamic project work needs to be done at the local level with community, youth and migrant workers' participation in order to enhance their lives and livelihoods and to ensure that they do not engage in distressed seasonal migration in the future. Most vital long-term policy measure as an urgent prophylactic against prevailing migrant labor crisis is to improve and correct all the structural and institutional norms at the macro and micro levels, which will improve the urban infrastructure of poor people, invest substantially in community housing, invest in development of the areas where they live, provide them with decent kind of housing, access to all basic kind of civic amenities that are required for healthy living, apart from stressing on the necessity of universalization of the public distribution system that will make policies and programs that will support migrant workers. And lastly, implement some of the important stringent labor laws which have been discarded at several states in India, which were meant to support the rights and liberties of the migrant laborers. To conclude, I would like to end by quoting Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I think that he is extremely pertinent in this context. When Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was addressing this letter to his fellow clergymen from the Birmingham City Jail during the American Civil Rights Movement, his prophetic luminous vision was reflected in constructing a concrete algorithm for fighting all manifestations of injustice, while beseeching us to disregard the regressive attitudinal component of extreme individualism. In the context of migrant laborers, I think, and to quote Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. So being the voiceless section of the Indian social order, whose body of rights and liberties remain eclipsed due to chronic lack of timely governmental action and lack of societal empathy, the historically pitiable condition of migrant workers needs to be ameliorated as soon as possible. Thank you so much.
Right, thank you, Abhijan. That's a really interesting paper. I think it's also kind of timely because we know we have had this move away from neoliberalism back towards a new kind of Keynesianism. And I think that's what you're highlighting quite well in terms of the importance of social security and the importance of health, the importance of education. But this has also come with a backlash because we know that socialism is seen as a dirty word in many countries, even though India has a very long and rich history of a social welfare state, maybe in an effective social welfare state, but it's been kind of quite politically central. But of course, the big question is, how do you pay for that? Do you have any ideas on that? How would you pay for the welfare state in India?
So I think India is essentially now functioning like a night watchman state. It is like a right-wing libertarian, everyone's dream. It is leaving everything to the instrumentalities of the market with reduction of state controls and privatization, increasing privatization, and it is creating a huge furor across different status and power structures across the society. With the ongoing farmers' protests and the collective unrest of different communities, we're witnessing how it has come to the forefront. So I think that there needs to be a coherent and prudent policy measures, and a whole change of attitude in this particular regard.
Yeah, great. Good points. Okay, thank you for that. And that was a really interesting talk. So we'll now go to the next speaker, who is Rituparna Nath, a postgraduate student from Rabindra Bhatri University, looking at dismantling the existence of migrant workers or refugees, intertwined and interchangeable identities. Rituparna, you can start your presentation.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon, sir. And I express my utter gratitude to you, Professor Michael Giorgio Hayes, for enriching this webinar since the beginning, entrusting upon us the conception of protection and its relation to vulnerability. And I express my thanks to Rabindra Bharati University, the Department of Human Rights and Department of Disability Studies for giving me this opportunity to be on this prestigious platform with such eminent persons. With all your permissions, I'm starting reading my paper. I'm Rituparna Nath, a postgraduate in English from Rabindra Bharati University in 2019. Though human rights by its name is entitled to all human beings in equal, the implementation to functionalize the contribution of these universal rights in the life in general may be reflected with various disabilities. This subject reflected with various disabilities. This subject is not only limited in this webinar, but it is entirely an issue to acclaim the attention of all the people in this world in general, and this method to make it more efficient to acclaim such an attention, I expect, must be constructed throughout this webinar, where being a participant, I think myself fortunate enough to witness this process, where amidst various encouraging and innovative paper presentations, I'm going to present a paper on dismantling the existence, migrant workers and refugees, intertwined and interchangeable identities with and without border. Keeping migration as the focus to survive, the migrant workers and the refugees both confront the uncertainties on their identities, their claims on the rights and to receive services, being without family to assure themselves to earn a life, bringing their human rights at stake. The key is migration for a refuge to survive. Because of the appearance of the COVID-19 pandemic to all the humans equally, they are now confronting bigger predicaments in their struggle to acquire the human rights whose main function seems to be set of a minimal standard on a global scale to guarantee the protection from the mistreatment generating from their existence. In a repressive society, people who are in power make their arrangement in secret, largely as a way of maintaining and furthering that power. People who are powerless make an open theater of violence. It is quoted in De Pietro 84. At the time of passing through various kinds of conflict, the operation of power helps to determine the acts of representation and position to shape the consciousness of millions. The gap between the patterns of leading the life between a citizen and a refugee is timelessly wide to be filled in reality. And some of such gaps may also be visible to an extent in the lives of the migrant workers. Citizenship treatment, as due to the coronavirus, it has become far perilous for them to be existing in a human life struggling for human rights. As a shared value, providing protection to people fleeing in search for a refuge is one of humanity's most long-standing traditions that has found a recognition in the international law by all 193 United Nations member states in the New York Declaration on Refugees and Migrants in 2016. While maintaining the distinction between the refugees and the migrant workers, as the migration of a refugee cannot be assuredly in a nation of the country of origin, amidst conflict and lethal threats on life, they may encounter some similar tragedy in life, like being exposed to physical harm over land and the sea voyages. Their access can be restricted with border closing, blocking the detention, and impediments to receive protection, difficulties at economic times that can outsource their existence even, where the moral courage and action of solidarity, both individually and communally, are inevitably necessary. The values of states exceeding the international treaties concerned with refugee protection is enlisted with in particular in the 951 convention and its 967 protocol. In the destabilized effect of population movements after the Second World War, the human rights visible in the international law of refugee protection must demand solidarity, responsibility to safeguard the rights wherever they are, to convey the message based on fundamental principles of humanity and human rights. The impact of migration on the countries of origin, transit, and destination opens up new challenges requiring strategies to manage this action. At the time, to consider the positive outcomes inducing economic growth, reducing poverty globally through the accelerated movement of commodities, capital, and ideas. It's some of works in the migrant workers, various factories, organizations, household on the metropolitan cities, considering more than their capacity to labor even with low amount of wages, serving their life as they can, should claim for and must be given in the form of public, administrative, and social cooperation, specifically at the time of such endless onslaughts on human life by a virus with its conventional invisibility. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1948, along with its constituting articles, may be mentioned as to throw light on the unforgivable violation in the living of migrant workers and refugees. And in Article number 1, all the humans are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Article number 3, right to life, liberty, and security. Article number 13, right to freedom of movement. Article number 15, right to a nationality, and Article number 22, right to social security. Article number 28, everyone
Ma'am,
is...
you have 1 minute left.
Okay. The migrant workers suffer in the structure daily wage considering their labor payment with no work and no pay. The precautions of the mandatory mask and mouth and hand washing and sanitizer on the palms of the migrant workers cannot be an effective solutions on their life. The fare of the vehicles transports are even taken from them despite the governmental instructions. The first modern definition of international refugee status even cannot go with the idea of the Rohingya refugees, because the Rohingya refugee crisis refers to the forcible displacement of Hindu and Muslim Myanmar nationals from the Arakan and Rakhine state of Myanmar to neighboring Bangladesh, Malaysia, India, and Thailand. In the camps of Bangladesh, there is seen a vast conglomeration of human settlements that ought to be called a city with its own version, but it is struggling to be a civilization still, because there is a need of a lot of funds to make it visible, having a standard of a secure human life, where altercations and catastrophe of life are making their lives more vulnerable, despite in spite of having the food, medicine, and space, but they are lacking to be adequate to their standard of life. Pathetic similarities and dissimilarities between them. The refugee escapes to avoid death, murder, unrest, prison, persecution, and no state of living workers, and migrate to save their family and working laboriously crossing huge distance. The situations and identity are intertwined, considering the identity and situations are shaped and both are enforced upon them.
Ma'am, you need to wrap it up, please.
Okay, to conclude, I want to say that the events and the violation of the human rights are all too real, but human rights is nothing but a concept. Being an instrument, a medium to express our thoughts, its utilized functionalization requires the sympathetic understanding of the human experiences. Jonathan Glover has suggested that the most of the people in most of the time, the virtues matter in personal and narrow scope of ordinary kindness. As the Universal Declaration of Human Rights makes a grand set of promises, there has been obviously a wide gap between the promises and the real world of human rights violation. The problem is in the implementation of the ideals, depriving from the fact of its lack of composability gives answer itself, as the vulnerability enforced so concretely on the lives of the Rohingyas and the migrant workers may be treated only by the solution effective enough to throw out the inherent dilemmas to that extent to make the humans understand that these rights are for
Ma'am,
all.
we need to
And it is
conclude.
yes,
I'm
for
very
the last
sorry.
line, it is constituted with rooted claim of the cooperation of each other to make it a universal reality. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Ripana. I think there were a lot of interesting ideas introduced there, because I think highlighting this issue between this distinction between refugees and migrant workers, like that history goes back right to the 1920s and 1930s, when originally the main refugee organizing body was the ILO, because they saw the migrant workers and refugees were the same. And there's been some really interesting histories written quite recently, kind of going back and looking at that history, saying, well, refugees and migrant workers are kind of the same. They emerged at the same time. But then various states intervened to say, no, we want to separate, we want to have a separate body. And as a result of that, the kind of human rights protecting, human rights in the migration process and human rights protecting migrants has been a real patchwork, because you have the different Refugee Convention, Migrant Workers Convention, UDHR, Trafficking Convention, and so on. And they're all managed by different bodies. They're all managed in different ways. Some are human rights laws, some are international criminal laws, some are refugee laws, some are IHL laws, and so on. And so the protection there has always been this kind of patchwork, which has made real challenges, as you're kind of pointing out, to recognising the rights of migrant workers. And in a sense, the UDHR has been one of the weakest, because it's not legally it's not legally binding, and it doesn't kind of directly address migrant workers, and states can quite easily just choose to ignore the UDHR. But it was interesting also you were getting onto the Rohingyas at the end, because they're a group that kind of tick all the boxes. They are refugees and stateless, and often migrant workers, and so yeah, that's kind of interesting.
Thank
Do you have any final comments to make on your paper?
The comment I want to make on this paper is that the human rights must be linked with human sympathy. First of all, we should think that the people with whatever ethnic and racial identity, with whatever place their residential identity, whatever they have, or both all are identities, and identities are changeable. And if identities are changeable, we can think that the core of their identity, whatever they are actually humans. So the identity of humanity should be kept at first, to understand the actual predicaments of their life. Otherwise it is impossible for all of the laws to get rid of such terminal actions on them, that may be possible only by understanding the humanity inherent in their identity.
Yeah, a good final point, and also identifying and combating all those processes of dehumanization, dehumanizing migrants and dehumanizing foreigners and dehumanizing other marginalized groups. So great, thank you very much, Ripana, for that paper. That was really interesting. And now we're on to our final paper by Ms. Divaneshi, that's right, Agarwal, on migrants and contemporary settlers. Hi, Devanshi, so you can start when you're ready. Maybe you're on mute. Do you want to check that you're, yeah, you'll have to unmute yourself. Yeah.
Ms. Devanshi, you're frozen, I think, unmute. Okay, she's maybe with some technical issues. We are going to wait for her to come back. Here she is. I'm adding you to the screen. Now it's working? We can hear you. No, you are not audible. Maybe if you have headphones to put. No.
Am I audible?
Now,
am I
yes.
audible?
Yes, now yes.
Hello, am I
Okay,
audible?
Yes. Now I let you start. You are not audible. No. Check if you use some headphones, maybe.
Am I audible now?
Now, yes. Now, yes.
Okay. Okay, there must be some issue then. So sorry.
Okay. Don't worry. Don't worry. You can continue. Good luck.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to present my paper on the topic Migrants, the Contemporary Settlers. Next slide, please. So actually, in the same world, we are living in two different worlds. One where there's a child who's born in a multi-specialty hospital with proper vaccination, round-the-clock care, best nutritional food, and at the same time, there is a child born in the most subhuman conditions, no vaccination, no basic health care. The mother has to carry that child along with her to the work because her economic condition will not allow her to take a maternity leave, and the only nutritional source is the mother's milk. So while India is developing and becoming one of the most developed countries, there is still a section of society who is not getting even the basic health facilities, educational facilities, and political freedom. Next slide, please. So, since my paper also highlights the impact of the pandemic, there have been 63.7 lakh migrant workers who have displaced from the urban cities back to their villages, mainly from Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, and Madhya Pradesh, because most of the rural people from these states come to India in search of work. And while it might be just a 68-day lockdown for us, there have been loss of 198 migrants' lives. There have been roadways accident, railway accident, and a lot of suicides. So the Ministry of Labor has very carelessly said that since there is no record, there is no compensation. So I think this is the very reason why these migrant laborers are going back to their villages, because they do not trust the employers, they do not trust the authorities at all. And India already has 30% of casual workers who have no social security, no maternity benefit, no job security. So, again, because of this pandemic, the people who were running even the small business units and were having regular salaried jobs have to resort back to the casual work. Next slide, please. So the conditions of working have gone down as well with time, which is again contrast to the modern society we are living in. So while we are developing with time, there has been no improvement in the working hours, salaries, sick leaves, or job security of these migrant workers, which are there in the MNCs. So we think it's very easy to fool the ones who are in desperate need of money to feed their families. So the only support they have is the money they earn to feed their families. Next slide, please. So I think what actually worked in this pandemic and what could have worked and what can also work in the general time period is that there has to be a mutual alliance between the employer and between the employee. So even the owners of production have faced consequences in this recession period in pandemic. So they have also gone into losses. They're not able to pay the salaries to the workers. But what works here is mutual trust and not labor laws. So basically, even the employer is facing a trouble, but then still some of the employees have given advance to the employees, or either they have promised to pay in the future or have not paid at all, but at least given this much of assurance to them that they'll be kept in the same job for more period. That is, they have received at least social support, if not even economic support. So I think the employers understand the employees very well and these migrant workers and how they can be alleviated out of their situation. Next slide, please. So my conclusion is basically that while we have so many legal obligations with us, what I've mentioned on the left are all the laws which might protect these migrant workers, but what actually works in the present context are the moral obligations. So what I've written in red is that all Indian citizens have the right to reside and settle in any part of the territory of India. This is what Article 19 of our Constitution says. But what I've written in the black, continuing this, is that along with this legal obligation mentioned in the Constitution, they also have the right to self respect, basic amenities, shelter, and political freedom. So I think if we are failing to follow the legal obligation, let us just be humans first and follow the moral obligation. Thank you.
Great, thanks for that. That's an interesting paper, picking up some of the issues on internal migration in India, much like some of the early papers as well. And I noticed that a couple of papers have talked about moral obligations and how to enforce or how to encourage that. But Devanshi, how do you think you would encourage a moral obligation?
So I think most of the crimes as well which are taking place nowadays are because we have forgotten how we are humans first. So I think humanity is much more important. And while we are having professional relationships, I think in the workplace, there also has to be some social touch with the people whom we are employing.
But how do you do that? How do you make sure humanity comes first? Is it an education program, or is it a public program from the government? How do you think you do it?
Yes, sir. Of course, literacy has to play a greater role, but I think those who are literate also at times forget how they have to apply their education. So I think it's more important for the government as well to protect the migrants. But moreover, I think these migrants have now become a topic of the they are a part of the election manifestos. But when it actually comes to the implementation of the programs, they are somewhere left behind. And also because the migrants themselves are not educated, it's very difficult for them to realize their rights. So I think education of both from our part as well and from the migrants part as well is important.
Great. Okay, thanks for that. Now I think we still have 5 minutes left for questions, and I was just checking to see if there are questions coming in, but I think the only question we have so far is on opinions about refugees. So we're focused on the Rohingya refugees, but there are questions about other refugees, because there are a number of refugee populations. But I'm not sure if there are any paper givers who want to address that question. Do any of the paper givers want to talk about the importance of other refugee populations?
Sir, may I say? Sir, may I say something?
Yes, go ahead.
I focused my paper dismantling the existence on Rohingya refugees because the Rohingyas has been described as the most persecuted on the earth. I'm not hindering or regarding the dismantling of the other refugees like in Syria and Africa. Probably their condition are much more difficult to go with a standard of life. But the Rohingya refugees, I have focused on that because I focused on that keeping in mind the identity of refugee in general. If people can understand and communicate with the idea of the persecution and the misnomer and the denouement of the crisis of life of the Rohingya refugees, I think that the catastrophes of the life of the other refugees can also be understood, keeping in relation with that.
Yes, a good point. Now, I have another question. I think one of the issues that seemed to come up in a number of these papers was this rural-urban divide in India, where you have rural populations who are more marginalized, and that's where the people migrate from into the city, where they don't face their rights. And this urban-rural division is causing a lot of tension. And that occurs, in many countries around the world. Even in the United States, we can see the recent elections was largely a division between the rural areas and urban areas. But what are some of the features, or why has this occurred in India? Why is there such a strong division between the rural and the urban populations? And why does it relate to so many problems in terms of human rights and migration? Does anyone want to answer that question?
I think, sir, there is a stark contrast. So the division, like the front lines of the division, is getting exacerbated with each and every single passing day, despite having the increasing phenomenon of urbanization, with many people, the migrant laborers, especially moving to the urban areas for employment opportunities. Because everything comes down to the allocation of resources and also the economic imbalances of the regional inequality are the imbalances which have been institutionalized for several decades. So there is a huge, like, stark contrast, and also with regard to the education system, if we consider pedagogy as an important factor in this regard. So there is a stark technological divide, a digital division with regard to the access of education, and with the internet and the cyberspace not becoming like fully functional, operationalized, despite the government claims and all the bragging from different like sectors. And with the increasing electrification, we can see what is the ground reality. So yeah, this division is getting like there is a huge binarization between the rural and urban with regard to each and every single minute aspect.
And is there also a large cultural divide in how they see each other? Does someone else want to talk about that cultural division and the impact that has? Well, Abhijan, do you want to have any comments on that cultural division between the city and the country?
So culturally, I think it's about the normative and the ideational, the attitudinal component, essentially. And also everything boils down to how you are able to access the civic communities and how you are able to identify yourself as a proper citizen. So there are different factors involved in this case, because culture is essentially a handiwork of man, and it is a byproduct of our own civilizational ethos. So this division is only with regard to the governmental and the policy responses. It has been like strengthened for several decades.
Any other comments on that? Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Thank you for the question, sir. Also, I think also what Abhigyan said, adding to that, I think when we talk about the rural and the urban divide, I think most of it is actually getting very blurred, because as of now, while we at this, as he said, that there shouldn't be any binary, but when you talk about the migrants, the very pattern of migration right now in India is very different, because where we see that a person is going from the village to the city, and at the same time he's coming back to the same place on the very same day. So the rural urban linkages in terms of migration has to be better understood, because what we tend or what we term as rural has somehow been totally shaped into something else, or the very meaning of it is getting reshaped, because I think even rural is now getting a bit urbanized, and not that urbanization has been fully urbanized as we say, because there are a lot of economic complexes into it when we say that a lot of rural population inhabits the urban. So in that case, I think we need to kind of delve deeper into it, like how we see the rural urban linkages. It's not that sharp. I think it's very much in continuum.
Yeah.
Good.
What Tanya was telling.
The session
What
was
Tanya was
really
telling that.
engaging, but I would now
Yeah.
like to request the participants to wrap it up really fast. We are running out of time.
Okay, Ajit, 30 seconds and we finish.
Yeah, so in my paper also, I also talked about this commuting distance migrants. Like they commute every day on a daily basis to their workplaces, which is located at the nearby urban places, and they come back in the evening. So there is a continuous interaction between the rural and urban, and this is because of the temporary movement away from agriculture and temporary movement away from the village in search of the work, and that interactions bringing the cultural aspect to cultural aspect of urban to the rural and rural aspect to the urban. But the classification is not must or breeze because of the cultural aspects, like they need solidarity, or they never, the migrants worker never feel home to their workplace. That's why they're returning back to the village. For migrants worker, home means the village. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you for some, very interesting papers. I learned a lot by listening to you, and I found it very entertaining and interesting. I think we now have to hand it back over to the organisers.
Yes.
To Apasan.
Thank you to all the paper presenters. Your discussions made this session really very engaging. And now I would like to request Professor Sanjay Kumar Yadav sir, the coordinator of the Department of Disability Studies of Rabindra Bharati University, to provide a vote of thanks to Professor Michael George O. Hayes from Mahidol University, Thailand. Sir, over to you.
As beautiful things comes to an end, so does this week-long webinar. It was indeed a memorable journey where we have learned so many things, came across different ideas, got to listen to exalted lectures from eminent resource persons, and had a chance to gather knowledge from multiple presentations on several topics from presenters across the globe. Papers were invited on the themes of visible and invisible disability and human rights, women and girls, LGBTQI, child rights, senior citizens, ethnic and racial minorities, migrant workers and refugees, from academicians, scholars, health practitioners, social activists, social work professionals, human rights professionals, diverse disciplines professionals with expertise in the area, and students. It was overwhelming to see such a huge and positive response from across the world. We are delighted. This webinar was aimed to shed light on the vulnerable groups and the impact of COVID-19 on their human rights. With experts drawn from across the globe, this program was dedicated to discuss the methods of generating improvement in the lives of the most marginalized entities of our society. What can be more ironical than the very fact that in a world dominated by humans, not all can actually enjoy the rights freely. Due to the prevalent oppression, discrimination, injustice, and inequalities towards these particular groups of people by the civil society, they are often deprived of their basic rights. On the outbreak of the pandemic, these groups were more severely exposed to the threats which not only came from the virus, but as well from the society and its people. To demolish the barriers and abolish the margins between people, we need to make people more aware about individual rights and equal opportunities entitled under the umbrella of human rights. To achieve that goal, we have taken only a little step forward towards the ultimate destination, which will take a lot of time to travel with equal efforts and contribution from every single person of the society. Throughout the webinar, we have got to know about different laws, rights, and several measures that have been taken so far to generate equality and ensure rights of all, with the main focus centered on the pandemic. Thus, at the end of the event, it can be rightly said that all the lectures and presentations have successfully broadened our knowledge, and we have also got an opportunity to open our thoughts to collaborate with others. As we have arrived at the end of the whole program, on behalf of the Department of Disability Studies and the Department of Human Rights and Human Development, I am honored to propose the vote of thanks to all the people who have directly and indirectly contributed to this webinar on vulnerable groups and human rights. At the outset, it's a privilege to extend a very happy thanks to the Honorable Vice Chancellor, Rabindra Bharati University, Professor Sabyasachi Basurai Chaudhary, for believing in us and giving us an opportunity to organize this international webinar on vulnerable groups and human rights. I also wish to express my sincere thanks to the Registrar of Rabindra Bharati University, Dr. Subir Mathur, for providing us with great support and encouragement. I would like to express my heartfelt thanks to the Dean, Faculty of Arts, Professor Tarak Nath Adhikari, for his encouragement, guidance, and providing a stimulating environment for such educational developments. I also wish to express my gratitude to Professor Michael George O. Hayes, the Program Director and Chair, Institute of Human Rights and Peace Studies, Mahidol University, Thailand, for being a part of the webinar and enriching the subject with his illustrious interpretations and positive outlook. My wholehearted thanks go to Dr. Payal Rai Chaudhary, Coordinator of the Department of Human Rights and Human Development, for her dedication and continuous support throughout the webinar. Also, I would like to express my special and hearty thanks to all the eminent resource persons who have marked their presence and made the invited lectures, sessions, lot more illustrious, impactful, and apprising. It was an honor to have a panel of renowned dignitaries who graced the chair for the technical session. A warm thank you to all of them for engaging with us and being there to expand awareness of the topics that we enter. I would like to thank the students, Mr. Tarak Haldar, for providing impeccable technical support, Ms. Praveen Banu, Ms. Victoria Muller, Ms. Upasana Rose, Ms. Kubali Bhattacharya, Mr. Abhishek Vasiar, and non-teaching staff, Mr. Pradeep Das, who have enthusiastically put their full effort to operate and ensure the smooth management of the whole process throughout the webinar. Your constant involvement, consistent support, indomitable zeal, and commendable team efforts made this webinar a great success. Last but not the least, I also thank the participants for connecting with us through YouTube Live and showing their continuous support. Thank you once again. Over to Pastor.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you, Dr. Mike Hayes, for being with us here today. Thank you so much. And now, at the end of the session, I would like to thank every participants who stay connected with us via YouTube Live, all the paper presenters, and everyone who stayed with us for these 7 days and made this event a grand success. The paper presenters and the participants will be receiving their certificates very soon, and thus we conclude here the 7 days of international webinar on human rights and vulnerable groups organized by the Department of Human Rights and Human Development along with the Department of Disability Studies of Rabindra Bharati University, Kolkata. Wishing everyone a very good health, stay safe, stay aware, and have a good day ahead. Adios.